When the wagon rolled in carrying a woman instead of cattle, Wade Callahan knew someone's desperation had become his problem. The Ross brothers called it charity, delivering a widowed sister-in-law to a stranger's ranch like she was livestock nobody wanted. But the way they shoved Ivy Marlowe toward his porch, the way her eyes held nothing but cold calculation behind the bruises, told a different story. This wasn't rescue. This was disposal. And when Wade saw the fear she tried to hide as fury, he recognized something he'd spent 5 years running from, the look of someone who'd survived what should have killed them. Thank you for joining this story. If you're watching, please hit the like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale travels. Now, let's begin. The Montana Territory stretched wide and merciless under an October sky that promised early snow. Wade Callahan stood on the porch of his ranch house, one hand resting on the weathered post, watching the dust cloud grow on the eastern road. 3 years since anyone had come this far out on purpose. 5 years since he'd wanted them to. The wagon that emerged from the haze wasn't the freight hauler he'd been expecting. Wrong color, wrong build, and moving too fast for cargo that needed care. Wade's jaw tightened. The Ross brothers. He recognized the matched bays even at this distance. Recognized the way Morgan Ross drove like he was fleeing something instead of delivering it. They pulled up in a scatter of dust and stone, the horses blowing hard. Morgan set the brake with more force than necessary. His brother Clay jumped down from the back before the wheels fully stopped, landing heavy in boots that had seen better days and worse intentions. "Callahan!" Morgan didn't bother with pleasantries. "We brought what you asked for." Wade's eyes moved to the wagon bed. No lumber, no cattle, no supplies of any kind. Just a woman. She sat on a trunk that had seen rough handling, her traveling dress covered in trail dust, dark hair pulled back severe enough to hurt. Her hands were folded in her lap, but Wade noticed the white knuckles, the way her spine held rigid as fence wire. She didn't look at any of them, just stared at some fixed point beyond the barn like she was memorizing the horizon. "I didn't ask for this," Wade said. "You asked for help with the land deal." Morgan spit tobacco juice into the dirt. "This is help. Ivy here needs a place. You need a woman's touch on this property before winter. Seems like Providence." Clay laughed, the sound ugly. Providence. That's one word for it. The woman, Ivy, turned her head then, just slightly, and Wade caught the edge of her profile. A fading bruise along her cheekbone, yellow-green in the afternoon light. The set of her mouth that said she'd heard every cruel word they'd spoken about her and had stopped caring somewhere back in Wyoming. "Get down!" Morgan's voice hardened. "This is your stop." Ivy stood slowly, like someone who'd learned that fast movements drew attention. She stepped to the wagon edge without help, gathering her skirts with hands that didn't shake. When she jumped down, she landed solid, boots hitting packed earth with the sound of something final. Clay dragged her trunk off the back, let it hit the ground hard enough to make Wade wince. "Everything she owns, which ain't much, considering." "Considering what?" Wade's voice was quiet, but something in it made Clay step back. Morgan answered instead. "Her husband passed. Sudden. Family couldn't keep her. Too many mouths already, and with the questions folks were asking," he shrugged. "This seemed best for everyone." "Everyone meaning you." "We made arrangements, legal ones." Morgan pulled a folded paper from his coat. "You agreed to let us move cattle through your north section come spring. We agreed to send help for winter. Here she is. Ivy Marlowe, widowed, able-bodied, and in need of Christian charity." The way he said the last part made it sound like an accusation. Wade took the paper without looking at it. "And if I don't want this arrangement?" "Then we take back our offer on the spring grazing rights. You lose that access, you lose your connection to the territorial road. Good luck moving your horses without it." Morgan gathered the reins. "Your choice, Callahan, but we're leaving either way." Ivy still hadn't spoken, hadn't moved from where she stood beside her trunk, hands at her sides now, watching Wade with eyes that held no hope but plenty of assessment. She was measuring him, calculating whether this particular prison would be worse than the last. Wade looked at her, really looked. Mid-20s, he'd guess. Thin in a way that spoke of recent hardship rather than natural build. The dress had been good quality once, carefully mended now. Her hands showed work, calluses on the palms, a burn scar across 2 knuckles, and that bruise, greenish at the edges, purple at the center where someone's knuckles had connected with bone. "What questions?" Wade asked, still watching her. Clay started to speak, but Morgan cut him off. "Nothing that concerns you. Ranch accidents happen. Her husband drank, got careless on the stairs. Tragic, but not uncommon. Some folks in town got ideas, but nothing came of it. Nothing official." The way Ivy's jaw tightened told Wade that Morgan's version and the truth probably lived in different territories altogether. "And you're delivering her here because she's family by marriage, and family takes care of their own." Morgan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're doing our Christian duty. You should do yours." Wade folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket. The math was simple and cold. He needed that grazing agreement. The Ross family controlled access to the only practical route through this section of mountain country. Without it, his horse breeding operation died before it started. With it, he had a chance at making this isolated ranch into something that mattered. But the woman standing in his yard wasn't livestock or equipment. She was someone's problem being made into his. "I'll need to see the full agreement," Wade said. "Witnessed and filed proper." "It's at the land office in Elkton, recorded 3 weeks ago when you signed the preliminary." Morgan gathered the reins. "We upheld our end. You'll uphold yours, or we void the whole arrangement." Clay climbed back into the wagon, still grinning like he'd pulled off something clever. "Good luck, Callahan. You're going to need it." The wagon pulled away in another cloud of dust, Morgan pushing the horses harder than necessary, like he wanted distance between himself and what he'd just done. Wade watched them go, watched until they disappeared back into the vast stretch of territory that swallowed most things eventually. Then he looked at the woman they'd left behind. Ivy met his gaze directly now, and Wade saw what the Ross brothers had probably missed: intelligence sharp enough to cut, and anger cold enough to keep. She wasn't broken. She was bent, compressed, forced into a shape that didn't fit, but not broken. "I didn't ask them to bring you here," Wade said. "I didn't ask to be brought." Her voice was steady, lower than he'd expected, with an edge like winter wind. "But here we are. You have people? Anyone you'd rather go to?" "If I did, I'd be there." She glanced at the house, the barn, the empty corrals. "This is what's on offer. I'll take it or I won't. But let's be clear. I'm not here because anyone wanted me here. I'm here because I was inconvenient somewhere else." Wade appreciated the honesty. "Fair enough. I'm Wade Callahan. This is my land, about 600 acres of it, most of it vertical. I breed horses, or I'm trying to. Haven't had much success yet." "Ivy Marlowe." She didn't offer her hand. "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a garden. I can't do much with horses, but I learn quick. I don't steal, don't gossip, and I don't ask questions I don't want answered." "What happened to your husband?" Her expression didn't change. "I thought we weren't asking those questions. I'm asking this one." She studied him for a long moment, weighing something. Then she bent down, grabbed one handle of her trunk. Wade moved to take the other, but she'd already lifted it, muscles straining under the weight. She carried it 3 steps toward the porch before setting it down hard. "James Marlowe drank himself mean for 3 years. One night he came home worse than usual, fell down the stairs trying to get to where I was sleeping, broke his neck on the landing." She straightened, wiped dust from her hands. "I found him in the morning, felt relief before I felt grief. His brothers saw that relief and decided I must have helped him fall. No proof, just suspicion and the fact that a widow inherits unless she's proven guilty of murder. So they started asking questions, spreading doubt, making sure I couldn't claim anything. Then they brought me here." The way she said it, flat, factual, without asking for sympathy, told Wade she'd told this story before and had learned that emotion just gave people ammunition. "Did you?" Wade asked. "Did I what?" "Help him fall." Ivy's laugh was short and sharp. "If I'd wanted James dead, there were easier ways, but I won't pretend I mourned him the way a wife should. That make me guilty in your eyes?" "Makes you honest." Wade picked up the other end of her trunk. "Come on, I'll show you where you'll sleep." The house wasn't much, 2 rooms and a kitchen that shared space with a crude sitting area. Wade had built it himself when he'd first claimed this land, more focused on function than comfort. The bedroom was barely big enough for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. Wade used it for storage mostly, sleeping on a cot in the main room where he could keep the stove going through cold nights. He set the trunk down inside the bedroom door. It's not fancy. I didn't expect fancy. Ivy looked around, taking inventory. Dust thick on every surface, cobwebs in the corners, mouse droppings near the baseboard. When's the last time anyone cleaned in here? Been a while? I can see that. She turned to face him, and in the dim light from the window he saw how young she actually was beneath the weariness. Let's establish terms. You need help running this place. I need somewhere to be that isn't with the Ross family. I'll cook, clean, and keep house. I'll earn my keep and expect nothing beyond that. You'll leave me alone. I'll leave you alone. And when spring comes and your cattle deal is done, we'll see if this arrangement still suits. What if I want something more than that? Her hand moved to her pocket, where Wade could just make out the outline of something small and hard. A knife, probably. Then we'll have a different kind of conversation. But I'm guessing you're not that kind of man, or the Ross brothers wouldn't have left me here. Wade stepped back, giving her space. I'm not. But I'm also not running a charity house. You work, you earn your place. You don't work, this doesn't continue. Agreed. She looked past him to where afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating a sink piled with unwashed dishes, a table covered in old newspapers, and the remains of Wade's solitary meals. I'll start with the kitchen. You got food stored anywhere, or should I see what I can make from dust and spiders? Root cellar behind the house. Smokehouse has some venison, flour, and beans in the pantry, though the mice might have gotten to them. Ivy nodded, already moving past him with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste time on uncertainty. She assessed the kitchen with a glance that cataloged every failure: the grease-stained stove, the warped floorboards, the window that didn't quite close. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started clearing the table. Wade watched her for a moment, unsure what he was supposed to do now. He'd been alone so long that having another person in his space felt like an intrusion, even though he'd apparently agreed to it. I'll be out in the barn if you need anything, he said finally. Ivy didn't look up from the stack of plates she was carrying to the sink. I won't need anything. The dismissal was clear. Wade left her to it, stepping out into the October afternoon that had gone cold while he wasn't watching. The mountains to the west were already shadowed, the sun dropping fast toward the peaks. Another hour, and it would be dark. In the barn, his horses moved in their stalls, restless with the change in routine. Wade had 6 mares and 2 stallions, all bred for mountain work. Tough, smart, able to handle the steep terrain that made this part of Montana Territory valuable to anyone who needed to move through it quickly. The Ross brothers understood that value. That's why they'd wanted the spring grazing rights, why they'd been willing to make this strange arrangement to secure them. But delivering Ivy Marlowe like unwanted cargo, that was something else. That was disposal, not charity. Wade thought about the bruise on her face, the way she'd flinched when Clay dropped her trunk, thought about her husband falling downstairs while drunk, and the convenient questions that followed. The Ross brothers had something to hide, and they'd hidden it here, on Wade's land, using his isolation as a shield. He should have refused, should have sent them back to town, contract be damned. But the truth was, he needed that grazing route. Needed it desperately if he was going to make this ranch work. And another truth, one he didn't want to examine too closely. He'd seen the way Ivy held herself together with pride and spite, and something about that stubborn refusal to break reminded him of things he'd tried to forget. The barn door opened behind him. Wade turned, expecting Ivy with some question or demand. Instead, she stood silhouetted against the fading daylight, a bucket in one hand. "Pump's broken," she said. "Got a wrench?" Wade found his toolbox, pulled out what she needed. When he handed it over, their fingers didn't touch. Ivy took the wrench and disappeared back toward the house without thanks. By the time Wade finished evening chores, full dark had settled over the ranch. He came in to find the kitchen transformed. Not clean, that would take days, but organized. The dishes were washed and stacked, the table cleared and scrubbed. The stove was lit, heat finally spreading through the room, and something was cooking that actually smelled like food instead of just fuel. Ivy stood at the counter, cutting vegetables with quick, precise movements. She'd found an apron somewhere, tied it over her dusty dress. Her hair had started to come loose from its severe pins, dark strands curling around her face in the steam from the pot. "Fix the pump," she said without turning around. "Needed a new washer, but I found leather scraps in the barn. Should hold until you get proper parts." Wade hung his coat by the door. "You know your way around tools." "I know my way around making do." She scraped the vegetables into the pot, stirred once. "Supper in 20 minutes. I'm assuming you eat at the table, not standing over the stove like an animal." "I eat at the table." "Good, set it then." Wade almost smiled. Almost. He found plates and utensils set 2 places across from each other. When Ivy brought the pot over, he saw she'd made some kind of stew from the venison and root vegetables, thickened with flour, seasoned with dried herbs she must have found in the pantry. It wasn't fancy, but it was real food, cooked with care. They ate in silence. Wade because he'd forgotten how to make conversation, Ivy because she clearly had no interest in pretending this was anything other than what it was. 2 people using each other for survival, but the food was good. Better than anything Wade had made in the 5 years since he'd come to this isolated piece of Montana territory to forget things that wouldn't stay forgotten. He ate 2 bowls, then a third, and Ivy watched him with something that might have been satisfaction. "You were starving yourself," she said finally, "or just too stubborn to cook proper?" "Bit of both." "Well, you'll eat regular now. Can't have you dying of stupidity before spring." She stood, gathering the dishes. "I'll clean up. You look like you have more work to do." Wade did. There was always more work on a ranch this size with only one person running it. But he sat for a moment longer watching Ivy move around his kitchen like she'd been doing it for years instead of hours. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who couldn't afford to stop and think, who needed the motion to keep darker thoughts at bay. "The bedroom's yours," Wade said. "I sleep out here anyway, near the stove." Ivy paused, her hand stilling in the wash water. "That wasn't in our agreement." "Agreement was you work for your keep. Can't expect you to work without proper rest." "And where does a man's expectations usually go from there?" Wade stood, meeting her eyes directly. "I lost someone I should have protected. Swore I wouldn't put myself in that position again. So my expectations stop at an extra set of hands and someone to cook real food. Nothing more." Something shifted in Ivy's expression, not trust, but the possibility of it. "Who'd you lose?" "My wife. 5 years ago, different territory. Couldn't keep her safe when it mattered." He moved toward the door, reaching for his coat. "I'll be in the barn for another hour. Lock the door if you want." Outside, the October night had gone cold enough to sting. Wade walked across the yard, his breath clouding white. Behind him, lamplight glowed in the kitchen window, the first time that window had been lit after dark in more than a year. In the barn, the horses settled into their evening routine. Wade checked water, topped off feed, ran his hands over each animal checking for injuries or illness. The work was familiar, soothing, requiring just enough attention to quiet his mind. But tonight his mind wouldn't quiet. He kept seeing Ivy's face when the Ross brothers drove away, that careful blankness that hid calculation. She was planning something, maybe just survival, maybe something more. And Wade had just agreed to let her do it under his roof, tied to an agreement he hadn't fully read, connected to a family that had more secrets than they had cattle. The smart thing would be to ride into Elkton tomorrow, examine that filed agreement, find out exactly what he'd signed. The smart thing would be to establish clear boundaries, keep Ivy at a distance, make sure this arrangement stayed purely transactional. But Wade had stopped doing the smart thing 5 years ago, when he'd buried his wife and walked away from everything he'd known. Smart was what got you through life. Stubborn was what got you through the parts where life tried to kill you. And looking at Ivy Marlowe tonight, brittle and angry and absolutely refusing to break, Wade recognized a stubborn that matched his own. He just hoped it wouldn't get them both killed. When he came back to the house an hour later, the lamp was still burning low in the kitchen. Ivy sat at the table, a piece of paper spread in front of her, her face tight with concentration. She looked up when he entered, didn't bother to hide what she was reading. "This is the agreement," she said, tapping the paper. "The one they filed. I found it in your coat pocket." Wade hung up his coat, moved closer. "And it's worse than I thought." Her finger traced a line of text. "They didn't just arrange for me to work here. They signed over guardianship. Legal guardianship, like I'm a child or incompetent. Which means anything I inherit, anything that was mine from James, it goes through them first. And if I'm deemed unstable or unfit, they can petition to take control of it permanently. The anger in her voice was ice cold and precise. That's why they brought me here. Not charity. Control. They put me somewhere remote, somewhere they can point to and say, look, she's isolated, probably disturbed, definitely not capable of managing property. And when the inheritance questions get settled, they'll already have legal standing to take everything. Wade pulled out a chair, sat across from her. What inheritance? James owned land. Not much, but it bordered Ross property. Good water access, which they've wanted for years. His father willed it to James specifically, not to the family trust. Which means when James died, it should have gone to me. Her smile was bitter. But a murderer can't inherit from her victim. So they start rumors, make sure I can't prove my innocence, and even if no charges stick, I'm tainted enough that any claim I make looks suspicious. So they don't need you convicted, just suspected. Exactly. Ivy sat back, the paper crumpling slightly in her grip. And now they've got me here under guardianship, isolated enough that any odd behavior can be exaggerated. Give it a few months, have me declared unfit, and the land goes to James's closest blood relatives. Them. Wade looked at the agreement again, seeing it with new eyes. The language was careful, legal enough to hold up in territorial court. Morgan Ross hadn't just trapped Ivy, he'd trapped Wade too, tying them together in a way that made him complicit. Did you know about this before they brought you here? I knew they wanted me gone. Didn't know how thoroughly they'd planned it. She met his gaze. So now you know what you agreed to. Still want me here? Wade should say no. Should take her into Elkton tomorrow, find a lawyer, void this agreement, and let the Ross family and Ivy Marlowe sort out their own mess. It was the smart thing, the safe thing. But he looked at Ivy's face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the fury in her eyes that she'd turned into cold determination, and he thought about the person he used to be, before loss taught him that caring about anything meant risking everything. You kill your husband? He asked. No. You planning to cause me trouble? Not unless you cause it first. Wade nodded slowly. Then I guess we're stuck with each other, at least until we figure out how to unstick this mess. For the first time since she'd arrived, something like relief crossed Ivy's features. Not gratitude, she was too proud for that, but relief that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who wouldn't immediately throw her back to the wolves. I'll earn my keep, she said, and I'll fight for what's mine. But I won't drag you into it if you don't want to be dragged. Little late for that. Wade stood, moved to the stove where coals still glowed. They made it my problem when they tied that agreement to my land access, so we might as well figure out the problem together. Ivy watched him for a long moment, and Wade could practically see her recalculating, adjusting her understanding of who he was and what he might be willing to do. Then she folded the agreement carefully, set it aside. I'm going to bed, she said. We can figure out the rest tomorrow. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Wade heard the scrape of her trunk being pushed against it. Not a lock, but a barrier. A statement that said she wasn't ready to trust him yet, no matter what agreements they'd made. That was fine. Wade wasn't ready to trust anyone either. He banked the fire, blew out the lamp, and settled onto his cot in the darkness. Outside, wind picked up from the north, carrying the promise of weather. Snow coming, probably. Montana Territory winters were brutal at this elevation. They'd need to prepare, stock up, make sure the house and barn were ready. They'd need to do a lot of things. But tonight, lying in the dark, listening to the wind, Wade found himself thinking about something his father used to say. Sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same. Smart keeps you breathing, right keeps you human. Wade had chosen smart 5 years ago, chosen survival over everything else, isolation over risk, safety over meaning. Maybe it was time to choose different. In the bedroom, Ivy lay awake in the darkness, her hand wrapped around the knife she'd kept hidden since James's funeral. The knife she'd taken from his brother Clay when he'd cornered her in the barn, thinking a widow would be easy prey. She'd cut him shallow across the forearm, just enough to make a point, and he'd backed off with a curse and a promise that she'd regret making an enemy of the Ross family. She hadn't regretted it then. Didn't regret it now. But lying here in a stranger's house, in a stranger's bed, bound by agreements she hadn't signed and laws she didn't understand, Ivy felt the weight of how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. The Ross brothers had planned this carefully. They'd waited until she was vulnerable, friendless, suspected of murder. Then they'd shipped her off to the most isolated ranch in the territory, tied her to a man who needed them more than he needed her. Smart play. Cruel, but smart. Except they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed Wade Callahan was just another man who'd take what was offered and ask no questions. They'd assumed he'd be grateful for the arrangement, compliant with their plans. But Ivy had watched Wade tonight, watched the way he'd examined that agreement, the way his jaw had tightened when he'd understood what it really meant. He wasn't compliant. He was angry. And angry might be something Ivy could use. She'd survived James's drunken rages by being smarter, quicker, harder to hit. She'd survived his death by refusing to show the relief that would have damned her. She'd survived this by doing what she'd always done, watching, waiting, finding the crack in her opponent's armor, and driving a knife straight through it. The Ross brothers thought they'd won by getting her out here. They had no idea what they'd actually done. Ivy closed her eyes, knife still gripped in her hand, and started planning. Spring was months away. That was months to find evidence, build a case, prove that the inheritance was rightfully hers. Months to figure out if Wade Callahan was someone she could trust or just another obstacle to eliminate. Months to survive. Again. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and quiet, covering Montana territory in white that would last until April. Covering secrets, hiding truths, blanketing everything in cold beauty that killed as easily as it comforted. And in a small ranch house at the end of a lonely road, two people who'd been pushed together by other people's plans lay awake in the darkness, each wondering if they'd just made a terrible mistake, or possibly the first smart choice either of them had made in years. The snow that fell that first night continued through the next 3 days, transforming Wade's ranch into something from a different world. Ivy woke that second morning to find the windows frosted thick, the bedroom so cold her breath clouded white. She dressed quickly, layering what clothes she had, and emerged to find Wade already up, stoking the fire with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times alone. He looked up when she entered, nodded once, then went back to the stove. No greeting, no small talk, just acknowledgement that they were both awake and the day required surviving. Ivy appreciated that more than she would have appreciated false warmth. She made coffee from the grounds Wade had stored in a tin, watching the snow fall heavy outside the kitchen window. The world beyond the glass had disappeared into white. No horizon, no mountains, just endless falling snow that erased everything familiar. "Storm will last another day at least," Wade said, pouring himself coffee. "Maybe 2. We're snowed in until it passes." Ivy's hands tightened on her cup. Snowed in, trapped here with a man she didn't know, in a place no one could reach. The Ross brothers had planned that too, probably. Delivered her just before the first big snow, ensuring she'd have no way to leave, no way to contact anyone who might help. "You got enough food stored?" she asked. "Enough for a month if we're careful, longer if we're smart." Wade moved to the window, studying the storm. "Stocks sheltered, stoves solid. We'll be fine." Fine. As if being trapped together in a 2-room house while accusations of murder hung over her head was just another Montana winter. Ivy set down her cup harder than necessary. "I need to see what you've got for supplies. If I'm cooking, I need to know what I'm working with." Wade showed her the root cellar first, a dugout behind the house accessible through an exterior door that had to be shoveled clear. Inside, shelves held potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions. Enough vegetables to last, but barely. The smokehouse was better stocked. Venison, some elk, a side of bacon that looked like it had been hanging since last winter. "You hunt regular?" Ivy asked, examining the meat. "When I need to. Haven't needed too much, being alone." Wade's voice was flat. "I'll take down an elk or 2 this winter, maybe some rabbits if the snow gets deep enough to make them easy." Back in the house, Ivy inventoried the pantry with growing dismay. Flour, beans, some dried corn, a few tins of tomatoes, salt, sugar, lard. The basics, but nothing that suggested Wade had given any thought to variety or comfort. This was survival food, fuel food, the diet of a man who'd stopped caring what things tasted like. "You live like this all the time?" she asked. "Live like what?" Like you're punishing yourself for still breathing. Wade's expression went carefully blank. I live like someone who doesn't need much. Well, I need more than this. We've got 4 months of winter ahead. I won't spend them eating nothing but beans and jerky. Ivy pulled out the flour, checked the weevil situation, found it acceptable. I can make bread at least, and if you've got yeast or starter, I can do better than hardtack. No yeast, no starter. Then I'll make some. Need a potato and some of that flour. She was already moving, pulling ingredients, her mind calculating ratios and timing. And I'll need access to the chickens. Wade blinked. What chickens? The ones you're going to get. Because I'm not spending winter without eggs, and if you think I am, you're mistaken about how this arrangement works. For the first time since she'd arrived, something that might have been amusement crossed Wade's face. Nearest chickens are in Elkton, 15 miles through what's now 3 feet of snow. Then I guess you'll be making that trip when the storm clears. Ivy met his gaze levelly. I don't care how much it costs. I need eggs. I need milk if you can manage a goat, and I need some variety in these stores, or I'll go mad before Christmas. That in order? That's the terms of me staying. You want someone to cook and keep house? You provide what's needed to do it proper. Otherwise you get beans and jerky and can make them yourself. Wade studied her for a long moment, and Ivy could see him weighing whether to argue. Then he nodded slowly. Fair enough. When the snow clears, I'll go to town. Make a list of what you need. I'll make a list of what we need, Ivy corrected, because I saw how you've been living, and it's half a step from dying. That killed whatever amusement had been building. Wade's face went hard again, closed off. I've been doing fine. You've been surviving. There's a difference. Ivy turned back to the pantry, dismissing him. Now get out of my way. I've got bread to start and a kitchen to properly organize. She felt him watching her for another moment, then heard his footsteps retreat toward the door. The cold blast of outside air told her he'd gone to the barn, probably to escape her presence, her judgments, her insistence on making things different. Good. Let him escape. Ivy had work to do. She spent the morning transforming the kitchen from functional to something resembling civilized. Every dish got washed and put away proper. Every surface got scrubbed until the old wood showed its grain. She found mouse holes and stuffed them with steel wool from Wade's toolbox. Found the cracked window and stuffed rags around it to stop the draft. Found a system in the chaos and imposed it ruthlessly. By noon, the kitchen was warm and clean and smelled like rising bread dough. Ivy had set the starter near the stove where heat would help it develop, covered with a cloth that had seen better days, but was at least clean now. She'd made a pot of bean soup that actually had flavor. Onions, bacon fat, dried herbs she'd found in the back of the pantry. Not fancy, but honest food made with care. Wade came in stomping snow from his boots, his face red with cold. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the changes. The clean floor, the organized shelves, the pot on the stove bubbling with something that smelled like his mother used to make 30 years ago. You've been busy, he said quietly. I don't know how to be any other way. Ivy ladled soup into bowls, set one at his place. Eat. Then you're going to help me move furniture. Move what furniture? I've got a table and 2 chairs. Exactly. And that bedroom's got a bed that's slowly rotting into the floor. We're moving it out here, near the stove. You'll sleep warmer, and I'll use the cot in the bedroom where I can have a door. Wade sat slowly, picked up his spoon. That's a lot of work for something that doesn't matter much. It matters to me. I won't have you freezing to death because you're too stubborn to sleep near heat. She sat across from him, started eating her own soup. And before you argue that you've been fine, we've established that fine isn't good enough anymore. Why do you care if I freeze? The question was honest, not confrontational. Ivy considered how to answer it. The truth was complicated. She needed Wade alive and functional because he was her only ally in this mess, however reluctant. But there was something else too. Something she didn't want to examine too closely. She'd watched her husband drink himself to death slowly, watched him choose destruction over survival day after day. Watching Wade do the same thing in a different way stirred something in her that felt too much like caring. Because I'm stuck here with you, she said finally, and I'd rather be stuck with someone who's actually living instead of just waiting to die. Wade ate his soup in silence, but she could see him thinking. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and stood. All right, let's move the bed. It took them most of the afternoon. The bed frame was solid oak, heavy enough that they had to take it apart to maneuver it through the doorway. The mattress was another battle, stuffed with straw and corn husks, lumpy and moldering in places where moisture had gotten in. They hauled it outside, beat it with sticks until the dust made them both cough, then dragged it back in and positioned it near the stove where heat would dry out whatever dampness remained. They worked without much talking, just the occasional direction or warning. But Ivy noticed things, the way Wade favored his left side when lifting, the old scar across his knuckles that matched a fighting knife wound, the way he moved with military precision, every motion economical and purposeful. "You were a soldier," she said when they stopped for water. Wade didn't answer immediately. "Long time ago." "Which war?" "The one that mattered then. Doesn't matter now." He drank deeply, wiped his mouth. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who doesn't want any asked back." "I'm trying to figure out who you are. Seems relevant, given the circumstances." "I'm a man who owns land and breeds horses. That's all you need to know." "And the wife you lost? She part of what doesn't matter now?" Wade's expression went dangerous. "Careful." "Or what? You'll throw me out into the snow?" Ivy met his anger with her own. "I'm trying to understand what kind of man I'm depending on, whether you're someone who runs when things get hard or someone who stands." "I stood." Wade's voice was low and hard. "I stood until there was nothing left to stand for. Then I came here where standing doesn't matter because there's nothing left to protect. There's this ranch. This ranch is rocks and dirt and animals that'll do fine without me. And me? Will I do fine without you when the Ross brothers come back?" That stopped him. Wade set down his water, looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, and decided to stop seeing anything at all. "They won't come back until spring, and by spring, you'll have figured out what you want to do, where you want to go. I'll help you get there if I can, but I'm not your protector, Ivy. Don't mistake circumstance for something more." Ivy felt anger flare hot in her chest. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking if you'll stand with me when they come. There's a difference." "Why would I?" "Because they trapped you too. Used your need for that land access to make you complicit in their scheme. You think they'll honor that agreement come spring if I'm not here to use as leverage?" She moved closer, making him look at her. "They'll void it the second they don't need it anymore. Take what they want and leave you with nothing, same as they're doing to me." Wade's jaw worked. "You don't know that. I know men like the Ross brothers. They don't make fair deals. They make traps that look like deals until it's too late to escape." She stepped back, giving him space. "So yes, I'm asking if you'll stand, not because you care about me, but because you should care about yourself." The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither wanted to say. Outside, the snow continued falling, piling higher against the windows, burying the ranch deeper in white isolation. Finally, Wade nodded once. "I'll stand, but not because of the land deal. I'll stand because I'm tired of running from fights that matter." "This fight matters to you?" "No, but maybe it's time something did." It wasn't a declaration of loyalty or friendship. It was barely an alliance, but it was more than Ivy had expected, more than she'd let herself hope for. She turned away before he could see the relief in her face. "Good. Then help me get this cot into the bedroom so I can actually sleep tonight." They finished the furniture rearrangement as afternoon faded into early winter dark. The house looked different now. The bed positioned near the stove's warmth, the cot in the bedroom with Ivy's trunk beside it, everything rearranged to acknowledge that two people lived here instead of one person hiding. Ivy made dinner from the soup and fresh bread that had actually risen properly. They ate at the table like civilized people, and if the silence was still awkward, at least it wasn't hostile. When Wade went out for evening chores, Ivy cleaned up and then spent an hour going through her trunk, taking inventory of what she'd brought from her old life. Not much. 3 dresses, all black or dark gray, mourning clothes that the Ross brothers had insisted she wear even though her grief was more relief than sorrow. Undergarments mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. a shawl her mother had made, the only thing Ivy had from before she'd married James. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, the papers that proved her marriage, James's death certificate, and a copy of his father's will that left the borderland specifically to James Henry Marlowe. Her inheritance. The thing the Ross brothers wanted badly enough to orchestrate this entire scheme. Ivy spread the will on the cot, reading it by lamplight for the 100th time. The language was clear. The property went to James, not to the family trust. And if James died without children, it passed to his widow. The Ross brothers had no legal claim unless they could prove Ivy was unfit or guilty of murder. Hence the rumors. Hence the convenient delivery to an isolated ranch where any odd behavior could be exaggerated, where witnesses were non-existent, where Ivy's increasing isolation could be presented as evidence of instability. It was a good plan, thorough, legal enough to work, but it had one flaw. The Ross brothers had assumed Wade would be a passive participant, grateful for the grazing rights and unconcerned with Ivy's fate. They'd assumed wrong. Ivy carefully folded the will, tucked it back into its hiding place. Then she pulled out the knife she'd taken from Clay Ross and held it in her palm, feeling its weight. She'd cut him once with this blade. Would she need to cut him again? Or worse? A year ago, Ivy would have said no, would have insisted she wasn't capable of real violence, that surviving James's abuse didn't make her a killer. But a year ago, she'd still believed the world had rules, that justice existed for people like her, that truth mattered more than power. She knew better now. The door opened, Wade returning from the barn. Ivy slipped the knife back into her pocket, smoothed her expression into something neutral. When she emerged from the bedroom, Wade was at the stove, warming his hands. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "Horses are restless. They always know when weather's turning mean." Ivy joined him at the window, looking out at the darkness where snow fell so thick she couldn't see the barn. "How long before we can get to town?" "Week, maybe more. Depends how much falls and how fast it melts." Wade glanced at her. "You in a hurry to leave?" "I'm in a hurry to understand what legal standing I have, and whether there's anyone in Elkton who will help me fight for it." "There's a lawyer, Simon Wright. He's honest, which means the Ross family hates him." Wade moved to the table, sat heavily. "But honest doesn't always mean effective. The Ross brothers have money and influence. You've got accusations and suspicion following you. I've got the truth." "A truth doesn't win legal battles. Evidence wins legal battles." Wade looked at her directly. "Do you have any? Anything that proves you didn't kill James? That proves the Ross brothers are lying about the inheritance?" Ivy sat across from him. "I have the will. I have witnesses who saw James drunk that night, the bartender at the saloon, the man who helped him onto his horse. I have the doctor's report that said the injuries were consistent with a fall. What I don't have is proof that I wasn't there when it happened." "Where were you?" "In the bedroom with the door barred because James had been violent earlier that evening and I wasn't taking chances." She met Wade's gaze steadily. "I heard him come in, heard him stumbling around downstairs. Then I heard the crash and him screaming. By the time I got the door open and made it down, he was already dead." "And you felt relief?" "I felt like I could finally breathe, like the constant fear could end. Like maybe I had a future that didn't involve bruises and broken bones." Her voice was flat, factual. "Yes, I felt relief, and his brothers saw it on my face and decided that made me guilty." Wade nodded slowly. "I believe you." Ivy blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that. I've seen real grief and I've seen relief disguised as grief. You're not pretending, which means you're either telling the truth or you're the best liar I've ever met." He stood, moved to bank the fire for the night. "And if you were that good a liar, you'd be better at hiding how much you hate the Ross brothers." Despite everything, Ivy almost smiled. "I suppose I would." "So we operate on the assumption you're innocent, which means we need to prove it, or at least cast enough doubt on the Ross brothers' story that their guardianship claim falls apart." Wade straightened, wiping ash from his hands. "That means getting to town when the snow clears, talking to that lawyer, finding out exactly what legal options you have. And if there aren't any legal options?" Wade's expression went hard. "Then we find other options, but let's try the legal ones first." They settled into an uneasy routine over the next few days as the storm raged outside. Wade handled the stock and outdoor work, coming in frosted and half-frozen to find hot coffee and warm food. Ivy managed the house, transforming it bit by bit from a hermit's shelter into something resembling a home. She scrubbed floors, mended curtains, organized supplies with the precision of someone preparing for siege. And slowly, carefully, they started talking. Not about anything important at first, just small things. Wade explaining how he'd started the horse breeding program, the bloodlines he was working with, the reputation he was trying to build. Ivy describing the garden she'd kept at her old place, the vegetables she'd grown, the preserves she'd made until James had destroyed the jars in one of his rages. But the small things led to larger ones. Wade mentioning his father's ranch in Wyoming, the land he'd left behind when he'd enlisted. Ivy talking about her mother who'd died when she was 12, leaving her to raise her 3 younger sisters until each married and moved away. On the 4th day of the storm, Wade found Ivy standing at the window staring out at the endless white. Her shoulders were tight, her hands clenched at her sides. "You all right?" he asked. "I've been thinking about the timeline, about when they'll make their move." She turned to face him. "The guardianship gives them control, but they still need me declared unfit to fully access the inheritance, which means they'll be watching, waiting for evidence I'm unstable. And being isolated out here, cut off from everyone, getting more withdrawn." Well, Wade followed the logic. "That's the evidence they're building." "Exactly. By spring, they'll have witnesses who saw me once when they delivered me here. Traumatized, quiet, possibly disturbed. Then nothing for months. No one to testify I'm fine. No evidence I'm managing well." Ivy's voice went tight. "Just isolation, and whatever story they decide to tell about what that isolation did to me." Wade moved to stand beside her at the window. "So we make sure there are witnesses. When the snow clears, we go to town regular. You talk to people, show them you're stable and capable. Make friends if you can, or at least acquaintances who will remember you as normal. The Ross brothers will hear about it. They'll know I'm fighting back." "Good. Let them know. Let them understand you're not going to make this easy." Wade's reflection in the glass was hard, determined. "You said you needed to know if I'd stand with you. Well, I'm standing, which means we fight this smart, and we fight it visible. No hiding, no giving them ammunition to use against you." Ivy looked at him, really looked, seeing past the rough exterior and isolation-learned silence to something underneath that reminded her why she'd once believed in people. Wade Callahan wasn't a hero. He was damaged and withdrawn and clearly running from demons he wouldn't name. But he'd made a choice to stop running, at least for this. That was more than most men would do. "Thank you," she said quietly. Wade shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. This might get ugly before it gets better." "I'm not afraid of ugly. I married it and buried it." Ivy managed a thin smile. "But I appreciate having someone watching my back while I fight." The storm finally broke on the 5th day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, sculpted by wind into fantastic drifts that buried fences and made the landscape unrecognizable. But the sky cleared to brilliant blue, and the sun on snow was so bright it hurt to look at. Wade spent that day digging out, paths to the barn, to the smokehouse, to the root cellar. Ivy helped, wielding a shovel with the grim determination of someone who understood that survival required constant work. By evening, they were both exhausted, muscles aching, faces burned by sun and wind. But the ranch was accessible again, and more importantly, the road would be passable within a few days once the county crew came through with their plow wagon. "Tomorrow I'll ride into Elkton," Wade said over dinner. "Get supplies, talk to Simon Wright about your situation. See what legal standing we have." Ivy set down her fork. "I'm coming with you." "That's a hard ride, especially through snow." "I don't care. If we're making me visible, it starts now. And I want to look Simon right in the eye when we tell him what the Ross brothers have done." Wade studied her, then nodded. "All right, but we leave at dawn and we move fast. I don't want to be caught out if another storm rolls in." They spent the evening preparing, Wade checking tack and gear, Ivy making a list of supplies and packing food for the journey. When Ivy finally retreated to the bedroom, she lay awake for a long time, listening to Wade settle on the bed near the stove, listening to the house creak and shift in the cold. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow she'd stop being a victim of the Ross brothers' scheme and start being someone who fought back. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath she'd taken since James had died. Outside, the mountains stood sharp against the stars, beautiful and indifferent. Montana Territory didn't care about human struggles, human justice, human survival. It simply existed, vast and harsh and unforgiving of weakness. But Ivy had learned something in her years with James, something that had kept her alive when dying would have been easier. The territory might not care, but that didn't mean she had to accept what others decided was her fate. She'd survived a drunk's rage and a family's betrayal. She'd survived isolation and accusation and being treated like property to be disposed of. She'd survived this too, and when she was done surviving, she'd make damn sure the Ross brothers regretted every choice that led them to underestimate her. In the darkness, Ivy smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required teeth, and hers were getting sharper. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that froze breath in lungs and turned exposed skin numb in minutes. Ivy dressed in layers, every piece of clothing she owned, and still felt the cold seeping through when she stepped outside. Wade already had the horses saddled, his own mount and a smaller mare he said had steady footing in snow. "She's not pretty, but she won't dump you," Wade said, handing Ivy the reins. "Keep her head up and follow my line. Don't let her pick her own path or she'll find every drift between here and town." Ivy swung into the saddle, grateful for the years she'd spent on her father's farm, where riding had been necessity rather than pleasure. The mare shifted beneath her, testing, then settled when Ivy's hand stayed firm on the reins. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, turning snow into blinding white crystal. The road was barely visible, marked more by absence of trees than any clear path. Wade led them at a careful pace, his horse breaking trail through drifts that sometimes reached the animals' chests. Ivy followed in the packed snow, watching how Wade read the landscape, how he chose the route that balanced speed against safety. They didn't talk. The cold made conversation painful, and the focus required to keep the horses moving through deep snow took all their attention. But Ivy found herself studying Wade's back, the set of his shoulders, the easy way he sat his horse even in difficult terrain. This was a man who'd spent years in the saddle, who understood animals and land and how to survive in country that killed the careless. Whatever had driven him to isolation, it hadn't been incompetence. 2 hours into the ride, they crested a ridge and Elkton spread below them in the valley. It wasn't much of a town, maybe 40 buildings clustered around a main street, with a church steeple rising at one end and what looked like a mill at the other. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, the only movement in the frozen landscape. Wade pulled up, letting the horses blow. "We'll stop at the general store first, get your supplies, let people see you, then we'll find Simon Wright. And if the Ross brothers are in town?" Then we smile and nod and don't give them any ammunition. Wade glanced at her. "You can do that? Be civil even if they provoke you?" Ivy thought about all the times she'd smiled at James's family while they insulted her, all the times she'd swallowed rage and presented a pleasant face. "I can do civil. Question is whether they can." They rode down into Elkton just before noon, the main street busy with people doing the same thing they were, restocking after the storm. Wade led them to a building with a faded sign reading Hoskins General Merchandise and tied the horses at the rail. Inside, warmth from a pot-bellied stove hit like a physical force, making Ivy's frozen face ache as feeling returned. A woman behind the counter looked up, her expression shifting from professional welcome to surprise when she saw Ivy. "Wade Callahan. Been a while since you came to town." "Mrs. Hoskins?" Wade touched his hat brim. "Need to restock some things. This is Ivy Marlowe. She's staying at my place, helping with the ranch." Mrs. Hoskins was maybe 50, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and the kind of face that had learned to hide judgments behind pleasant neutrality. But Ivy saw the calculation happening, saw the woman connecting names and rumors. "Mrs. Marlowe, I heard you'd come to the territory. My condolences on your loss." The phrase was standard, expected. But something in Mrs. Hoskins' tone suggested she'd heard the other stories too, the whispers about stairs and convenient deaths and widows who didn't mourn properly. "Thank you," Ivy said, keeping her voice steady. "It's been a difficult time." "I imagine it has." Mrs. Hoskins pulled out a ledger. What can I help you folks with today? Ivy handed over the list she'd made, watching as Mrs. Hoskins read through it with raised eyebrows. Flour, sugar, salt, yeast, dried fruit, coffee, tea, canned milk, and a request for information about purchasing chickens and possibly a goat. This is quite a list, Mrs. Hoskins said. I'm planning to keep a proper household, Ivy replied. Wade's been managing alone too long. Time someone made sure he eats like a civilized person. That got a flicker of something warmer in Mrs. Hoskins' expression. Well, it's good to see someone taking care of things out there. Wade's a good man, but he's been letting himself go to seed since he came to the territory. She looked at Wade. No offense. None taken, Wade said dryly. It's a fair assessment. Mrs. Hoskins started pulling items from shelves, setting them on the counter. As for livestock, my nephew has chickens he's looking to sell. Good layers, well bred. And old Samuel up on the ridge has dairy goats. I can send word you're interested. I'd appreciate that. Ivy moved closer to the counter, lowering her voice slightly. Mrs. Hoskins, I want to be honest with you. I know there are stories about me, about my husband's death. I know the Ross family has been talking. Mrs. Hoskins' hands paused in their work. I don't put much stock in gossip. But others do, and I'd rather you hear the truth from me than decide based on rumors. Ivy met the woman's eyes directly. My husband drank himself to death over 3 years. The night he died, he fell downstairs while I was locked in the bedroom protecting myself from him. I didn't kill him. I just didn't save him, and I won't apologize for that. The silence that followed was heavy. Wade had gone still beside her, probably surprised she was being this direct. But Ivy had learned that sometimes the best defense was honest offense. Put the truth out before lies could take root. Mrs. Hoskins studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I appreciate you being straight with me. And for what it's worth, I knew James Marlowe when he was younger. He was mean even then. I can't imagine marriage improved him. It didn't. Then you have my sympathy for real, not just for show. Mrs. Hoskins went back to gathering supplies. And if the Ross brothers come around asking questions, I'll tell them what I think, which is that a woman has a right to protect herself, and what happens to a drunk man on stairs is usually his own fault. Ivy felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Thank you. They finished the transaction, Wade paying from a leather purse that looked thin enough to worry about. When they stepped back outside, arms full of packages, Ivy saw Wade's jaw was tight. That was risky, he said quietly. Telling her everything like that? Better she hears it from me than from them. At least now she knows I'm not hiding. Ivy secured her packages to the saddle. And she believed me. That's one person who won't stand with the Ross brothers when they make their move. Or she'll tell everyone in town exactly what you said, including the part about feeling relief at your husband's death. Good. Let them hear it. I'm done pretending I'm something I'm not. Ivy swung into the saddle. Where's this lawyer's office? Simon Wright practiced law from a small building near the church, identifiable by the hand-painted sign reading Legal Services, Wright and Associates. The associates part seemed optimistic, given the single desk visible through the window. Wade knocked, and a voice called for them to enter. Inside, the office was cramped but organized, every surface covered in papers and law books. The man behind the desk was younger than Ivy expected, maybe 35, with thinning hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he took his work seriously. Wade Callahan. Simon Wright stood, offering his hand. Didn't expect to see you in town this winter. Had business that couldn't wait. Wade shook his hand, then gestured to Ivy. This is Ivy Marlowe. She needs legal advice about an inheritance dispute. Wright's expression sharpened immediately. Marlowe, you're the widow from the Ross situation. He indicated chairs. Please sit and tell me everything because I've heard 3 different versions from 3 different sources, and I suspect none of them are accurate. Ivy sat and for the second time that day told her story. But this time she included everything. James's violence the night he died, the Ross brothers' immediate suspicion, the guardianship agreement they'd filed, and the inheritance they were trying to steal. Wright listened without interrupting, his pen moving across paper as he took notes. When she finished, He sat back, tapping his pen against his teeth. This is exactly the kind of legal maneuvering the Ross family excels at. Did you sign the guardianship papers? No. Wade did as part of a land access agreement, but they worded it to give them control over me without my consent. And you have the original will? The one leaving the property to James specifically? Ivy pulled the folded paper from her pocket, handed it over. Wright read it carefully, then read it again. When he looked up, his expression was grim. This is clear. The property goes to James, and upon his death without issue, to his widow. The Ross brothers have no legal claim unless they can prove you're unfit or that you caused his death. He set the will down. The problem is, they don't need to prove either in criminal court. They just need enough suspicion to convince a territorial judge to grant them guardianship permanently. In isolation, odd behavior, inability to care for yourself, all of that can be presented as evidence of instability. Which is why they put me on Wade's ranch, Ivy said. Maximum isolation, minimum witnesses to contradict whatever story they tell. Exactly. Wright looked at Wade. How's she been? Truthfully, any behavior that could be twisted into evidence of instability? Wade's voice was flat. She's been working harder than I have, keeping house, managing supplies, planning for winter. She's probably the most stable person I've met in 5 years, which says something unfortunate about my social circle. Despite the tension, Wright smiled slightly. Good. That's what we need. Witnesses to her competence and stability. Mrs. Hoskins, other townspeople, anyone who can testify she's managing fine. What about the guardianship itself? Ivy asked. Can we void it? Possibly. Wade signed under false pretenses. He wasn't informed this was a guardianship agreement, just a land deal. We can argue the guardianship provision should be severed from the rest of the contract. Wright made more notes. But that takes time. We'd need to file a petition, present it to Judge Morrison when he makes his circuit through here. That won't be until spring. Spring is when the Ross brothers will make their move, Wade said. Probably, which means we need to build your case now. Documentation, witnesses, evidence of competence. Wright looked at Ivy. I'm going to be blunt, Mrs. Marlowe. You're fighting against money, influence, and social prejudice. The Ross family is established here. You're an outsider, a widow, with suspicious circumstances around your husband's death. That's not a strong position. But I have the truth. Truth matters less than evidence in a courtroom. We need to make the truth visible and undeniable. Wright pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Here's what I recommend. First, you keep doing exactly what you're doing. Be visible, be competent, build relationships in town. Second, we find witnesses from your old town who can testify to James's drinking and violence. Third, we get the doctor's report on his death, make sure it's preserved and documented. Fourth, we look for any financial records that show the Ross brothers' motive for wanting that land. Ivy nodded, feeling hope and dread in equal measure. Hope that there was a path forward. Dread at how difficult that path would be. Can you help me? She asked. Officially, I mean. Will you take this case? Wright was quiet for a moment. The Ross family has deep pockets and long memories. They'll make my life difficult if I oppose them directly. I don't have much money, Ivy admitted, but I'll pay what I can. That's not what I'm worried about. Wright looked at her, then at Wade. I became a lawyer because I believe justice matters more than power. If I won't stand up for someone being legally robbed, what's the point of all these books and papers? He offered his hand. I'll help you. We'll fight this proper. Ivy shook his hand, feeling tears threaten for the first time since James died. Not tears of grief or fear, but of relief that someone with authority and knowledge was willing to stand with her. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank me yet. This gets harder before it gets easier. Wright gathered the papers. I'll start drafting a petition to void the guardianship. You focus on being the most boringly competent person in Montana Territory. Can you do that? I've been boring and competent my whole life, Ivy said. It's what I'm best at. They left Wright's office as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Wade led them to a small restaurant where they ate hot stew and bread, the first meal Ivy hadn't cooked herself in months. Around them, townspeople talked and laughed, the comfortable noise of community that Ivy had almost forgotten existed. Several people stopped by their table. Mrs. Hoskins to say her nephew would deliver chickens next week. a rancher named Tom Fletcher who knew Wade and wanted to talk horses, the preacher's wife who welcomed Ivy to the territory with what seemed like genuine warmth. Each interaction was brief, polite, unremarkable, but Ivy felt Wade's strategy working. Every person who saw her here, acting normal and stable, was a potential witness against the Ross brothers' claims. They were halfway through their meal when the door opened and Morgan Ross walked in. He saw them immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation. For a moment, Ivy thought he might leave, might avoid confrontation. Instead, he walked directly to their table. "Wade, Mrs. Marlowe." Morgan's voice was pleasant, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon after that storm." "Had business that couldn't wait," Wade said, not standing, not offering anything beyond acknowledgement. "Clearly." Morgan's gaze moved to Ivy, assessing. "You're looking well, Ivy. Ranch life must agree with you." "I'm managing," Ivy said carefully. "Good, good. That's what we hoped, that a quiet place away from sad memories would help you heal." The concern in his voice was perfectly calculated, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Though I worry about you being so isolated. If you need anything, family support or companionship, you just have to ask." The trap was obvious. If Ivy said she was fine, it confirmed the isolation. If she said she needed help, it suggested instability. Wade's hand moved under the table, a warning touch on her arm. "I appreciate your concern," Ivy said, voice steady. "But as you can see, I'm not isolated at all. I'm in town, meeting people, managing household affairs. Wade's been kind enough to provide transportation and support while I settle in." "Of course he has. Wade's a good man." Morgan's smile turned sharper. "Though I'm surprised you're out and about so soon. Most new widows take more time to grieve properly." There it was. The insinuation, the judgment, the suggestion that Ivy's lack of dramatic mourning proved something sinister. But before Ivy could respond, a voice came from the next table. "Morgan Ross, you leave that girl alone." Mrs. Hoskins stood, her face stern. "I've known you since you were in short pants, making trouble for your mother. Don't think I can't still take you to task for rudeness." Morgan's pleasant mask slipped slightly. "I was just expressing familial concern." "You were being provocative. There's a difference." Mrs. Hoskins moved to stand beside Ivy's chair. "Mrs. Marlowe was just in my store, conducting business like a sensible woman. She's doing fine without your concern." Other heads were turning now, watching the confrontation. Morgan's jaw tightened, clearly not expecting public opposition. "I'm sure she's managing." "But family has responsibilities." "Family should have thought of those responsibilities before shipping her off like unwanted baggage," Mrs. Hoskins interrupted. "Now, if you'll excuse us, these folks are trying to eat their dinner in peace." The silence that followed was pointed. Morgan looked around the room, seeing faces that ranged from curious to sympathetic, all of them focused on him rather than Ivy. He'd miscalculated, turned what was meant to be a subtle undermining into a public scene where he looked like the aggressor. "My apologies if I've caused offense," Morgan said finally, his voice tight. "Ivy, if you need anything, you know where to find us." He left without ordering food, the door closing behind him with more force than necessary. The restaurant slowly returned to normal conversation, but Ivy could feel the shift in atmosphere. People were watching her differently now, not with suspicion, but with something closer to sympathy. Mrs. Hoskins patted Ivy's shoulder. "Don't let him rattle you, dear. The Ross brothers think money gives them the right to bully people. Good to remind them it doesn't." When they finally left town, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Wade kept the horses at a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, his attention on the road ahead. They rode in silence for a mile before Ivy finally spoke. "That was dangerous. Mrs. Hoskins standing up for me like that." "That was exactly what we needed," Wade corrected. "Witnesses seeing you as the victim, not the villain. Morgan showed his hand, tried to intimidate you in public, and got called out for it. That's good for us. But now he knows we're fighting back. Knows I'm not going to disappear quietly. He probably already knew. We just confirmed it." Wade glanced at her. "You did well in there, stayed calm, didn't take his bait. That's harder than it looks." Ivy thought about all the times she'd stayed calm while James raged, all the practice she'd had at swallowing anger and presenting a pleasant face. I've had a lot of practice not reacting to provocation. I noticed. Wade's voice was quiet. Your husband taught you that. Among other things, Ivy didn't want to talk about James, didn't want to remember the years of learning which words triggered violence, which silences were safe. But it's useful now. So maybe something good came from it. Nothing good comes from that kind of teaching, just survival skills that shouldn't be necessary. The understanding in Wade's voice surprised her. Ivy looked at him more closely, seeing the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins harder than necessary. Your wife. Did someone hurt her? Wade was silent so long Ivy thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, I hurt her. Not with fists, but with absence. She needed me to be present, to fight for what we had, and I was too focused on proving I could handle everything alone. When danger came, I wasn't there, and she paid for my pride with her life. What happened? Raiders. During the territorial conflicts down in New Mexico, I was away buying horses, thought I'd left her safe. They came through, burned homesteads, killed anyone who resisted. His voice was flat, emotion scraped away by years of retelling. Found her 3 days later when I came back. Buried her where the house had been and left. Never went back. Ivy felt the weight of that loss, the guilt that drove a man to 5 years of isolation. It wasn't your fault. I know that in my head. Doesn't change what I feel. Wade guided his horse around a drift. But I learned something from it. Learned that running from responsibility doesn't undo the damage, just spreads it different. Is that why you're helping me, trying to make up for her? Maybe partly, but mostly I'm helping because it's the right thing, and I'm tired of avoiding right things because they're hard. They rode on through the gathering dusk, the ranch lights eventually visible in the distance like a beacon in the frozen wilderness. When they finally dismounted in the barn, both of them stiff and aching from the long ride, Ivy found herself standing close to Wade in the lamplight. Thank you, she said, for standing with me today, for introducing me to Simon Wright, for all of it. Wade unsaddled his horse with practiced efficiency. We're in this together now, whether we planned it or not. Still, you could have left me to fight alone. Could have. Didn't. He looked at her over his horse's back. And I won't. Whatever comes, we face it together. Understood? Ivy nodded, feeling something shift between them. A recognition that this alliance had become more than convenience, that somewhere between the storm and town and Morgan Ross's confrontation, they'd become partners in something that mattered. That night, after evening chores and a simple dinner, they sat at the table going over everything Simon Wright had told them. Wade made notes in careful handwriting, listing what they needed to gather for the case. Ivy added names of people who might testify about James's drinking, about the Ross brothers' immediate move to take control of the inheritance. It's a lot, she said finally, and we've only got until spring to pull it together. Then we'd better get started. Wade set down his pen. Tomorrow I'll ride to your old town, talk to the doctor who examined James. Get that report in writing. You stay here, keep building the household back up. Give us evidence of competence. I should go with you. Too risky. If the Ross brothers are watching, they'll see you running around trying to build a case. Better you stay here, be the stable widow managing her new home. Wade's logic was sound, but Ivy hated it. I don't like sitting idle while others fight for me. You won't be idle. You'll be managing 600 acres, dealing with livestock when that nephew delivers chickens, keeping this place running. That's not idle. That's building evidence that you're capable and stable. Ivy wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The case they needed to build required her to be boring, competent, unremarkable. Running around gathering evidence would undermine that image. Fine, she said, but I want regular reports. Everything you find, everyone you talk to, I need to know what's happening. You'll know everything I know, Wade promised. We're partners in this. Partners. The words settled between them with unexpected weight. Ivy had been married to James for 3 years and never felt like his partner, just his property, his burden, his victim. But here with Wade, building a case for her freedom, fighting together against a common enemy, partnership felt real and solid. It was the strangest thing to find hope in, but Ivy would take it. Later, lying in the bedroom with the door open so heat from the stove could reach her, Ivy listened to Wade settle into sleep in the other room. His breathing evened out, the house creaked and settled, and outside the window the Montana night was full of stars and cold and infinite possibility. The Ross brothers thought they'd won by trapping her here, thought isolation would break her, that lack of support would force her to surrender the inheritance just to escape. They'd underestimated her, underestimated Wade, underestimated what desperation and determination could accomplish when given direction and support. Come spring, when they made their final move to take everything she had left, they'd find Ivy. Marlo wasn't the broken widow they'd shipped to the middle of nowhere. She was someone who'd survived worse than them and learned that survival sometimes required fighting back with everything you had. And she was just getting started. Wade left 2 days later, riding out before dawn with saddlebags packed for a journey that would take at least a week. Ivy stood on the porch watching him disappear into the gray winter morning, fighting the urge to call him back. She'd been alone before. 3 years of marriage to James had been a particular kind of isolation, but this felt different. This was choosing to be vulnerable, trusting that Wade would return with what they needed while she stayed behind building a life that could withstand scrutiny. The first day passed slowly. Ivy threw herself into work, scrubbing the bedroom until the floor showed its original color, mending curtains that had hung ragged for years, organizing the pantry with obsessive precision. By evening, her hands were raw and her back ached, but the house looked more lived in than it had since she'd arrived. Evidence of competence, she reminded herself. Evidence of stability. The second day brought Mrs. Hoskins' nephew with a crate of chickens. He was maybe 20, shy in the way of young men unused to talking with women, but he helped Ivy set up a makeshift coop in the barn and showed her how to encourage the hens to lay in the nesting boxes rather than hiding eggs in corners. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying," he ventured as they finished, "it's good someone's looking after Mr. Callahan's place. He's a good man, but he was letting things go to ruin." "He's been kind to me," Ivy said carefully. "I'm glad I can help in return." The nephew nodded, pocketing the money she'd counted out from Wade's store of coins. "Folks in town are talking, you know, about you and the Ross family. Most people think you got a raw deal." "Most people?" "Well, the Ross brothers have friends. Men who owe them money or favors. They're spreading stories." He looked uncomfortable. "Just thought you should know." Ivy felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of stories?" "That you're not right in the head. That being out here alone is making you strange. That Mr. Callahan's too isolated to notice you're getting worse." The nephew shifted his feet. "It's nonsense. Anyone can see that. But some folks believe what they're told, especially when it comes from men with money." "Thank you for telling me." Ivy kept her voice steady, even as anger coiled in her chest. The Ross brothers were already moving, already building their narrative. "If anyone asks, you can tell them I seem perfectly sane to you. Hardworking, competent, managing just fine." "Yes, ma'am. I'll do that." He tipped his hat and left, his wagon creaking down the snow-packed road. Ivy stood in the barn doorway watching him go, her mind racing. The Ross brothers weren't waiting for spring. They were laying groundwork now, planting seeds of doubt that would bloom into full accusations when the time came. Every week she spent isolated out here gave them ammunition. The strange widow, alone on a remote ranch, probably talking to herself, probably losing her grip on reality. She needed to be more visible, needed witnesses who could contradict those stories with first-hand accounts. But without Wade to provide transportation, she was trapped here by miles of snow and winter cold. Unless she made her own opportunities. The next morning, Ivy bundled herself against the cold and walked the perimeter of Wade's property, taking mental inventory. The ranch covered 600 acres, most of it too steep or rocky for farming, but perfect for horses. Wade had fenced the usable sections, built corrals and shelters, created something real from raw land. But he'd done it alone, and the signs of solitary work were everywhere. Repairs done halfway, projects abandoned when the effort outweighed the immediate need. The slow decay that happened when no one cared enough to maintain appearances. Ivy started fixing what she could. She repaired fence sections using wire and tools from Wade's barn, working through cold that made her fingers clumsy. She cleared brush from around the outbuildings, stacked firewood properly instead of in haphazard piles, organized the tack room so equipment could be found without searching. Every improvement was visible, documented by her presence and effort. On the fourth day, a rider appeared on the eastern road. Ivy's hand went to the rifle Wade had left her, her body tensing until she recognized Tom Fletcher, the rancher who'd spoken to them in town. He rode up to the house with his hat pulled low against the wind. "Mrs. Marlowe, hope I'm not intruding." "Mr. Fletcher." Ivy set the rifle aside, conscious of how it must look. A woman alone, armed, greeting visitors with suspicion. "What brings you out here?" "Noticed your fence line from the road. Saw you've been working on it." He dismounted, studying the repairs with a practiced eye. "Good work. Most folks wouldn't bother in winter." "Most folks aren't trying to prove they're capable of managing a ranch," Ivy said before she could stop herself. Fletcher's weathered face creased in something like sympathy. "Heard about your situation? The Ross brothers and their scheming?" He pulled out a tobacco pouch, rolled a cigarette with cold, stiffened fingers. "Wanted you to know you've got neighbors who don't buy their version of events." "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's practicality." He lit the cigarette, exhaled smoke that was barely distinguishable from his frosted breath. "The Ross family has been buying up land in this territory for years, using legal tricks and intimidation. They tried to run me off my place 5 years back, claimed water rights that didn't exist. Would have succeeded too, except I had a good lawyer and stubborn pride." Ivy felt hope stir. "Simon Wright?" "The same. He saved my ranch and cost me a year's profit in legal fees, but it was worth it to keep what's mine." Fletcher studied her through the smoke. "Point is, I know how they operate, and I know what it's like to fight them. If you need anything, witness testimony, character reference, whatever, you let me know." "Why would you help me? You barely know me." "Because right matters more than convenient, and because Wade Callahan's a good man who deserves better neighbors than he's had." Fletcher dropped the cigarette, ground it out with his boot. "Also, my wife made me promise to check on you. She's convinced you're out here slowly losing your mind from isolation." Despite everything, Ivy almost laughed. "And what will you tell her?" "That you're repairing fences in January like a sensible rancher, which means you've got more sense than half the men in this territory." He swung back into his saddle. "We're having a gathering at our place next week. Nothing fancy, just neighbors sharing food and gossip. You should come. Show people you're not a hermit." "I don't have transportation. Wade's away gathering evidence for the legal case." "I'll send my son to fetch you. He's 17 and needs practice being useful." Fletcher gathered his reins. "Consider it decided. You'll come, you'll be boringly normal, and you'll give the gossips less to work with." He rode off before Ivy could argue, leaving her standing in the cold feeling like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as the Ross brothers intended. Wade returned on the 8th day, riding in just before sunset with his horse blown and his face haggard from travel. Ivy met him at the barn, taking his mount's reins while he dismounted stiffly. "You look terrible," she said. "I feel worse." Wade unsaddled with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. "But I got what we needed." Inside, over coffee and the stew Ivy had kept warm, Wade spread papers across the table. The doctor's report on James Marlowe's death, signed and notarized. Witness statements from 3 townspeople who'd seen James drunk the night he died. A letter from the bartender confirming James had been drinking heavily for hours before going home. And most damning of all, a property survey showing the land James inherited sat directly between Ross Holdings and prime water access. "The motive is clear," Wade said, tapping the survey. "They need that land to expand their cattle operation. Without it, they're landlocked from the eastern ranges. With it, they control water rights for 3,000 acres. Ivy studied the documents with growing satisfaction. "This is good. This proves they had reason to want James dead and me discredited. It proves motive, but it doesn't prove they're lying about your competence." Wade pulled out another paper. "That's why I also got this. A letter from your old landlady. She writes that you were a model tenant, kept house beautifully, showed no signs of instability even while married to a violent drunk. She's willing to testify to your character." "Mrs. Chen wrote that." Ivy felt tears threaten. The elderly Chinese woman who'd owned the boarding house where Ivy and James had rented rooms had been kind, but Ivy hadn't expected her to risk involvement in a legal battle. She did more than that. She saved the rent ledgers showing James was often late paying because he spent money on alcohol, and she kept records of times she heard him threatening you through the walls. Wade's voice was gentle. She said to tell you that she knew you were suffering and she's sorry she didn't do more to help. Ivy had to look away, blinking hard. I need to write her a thank you letter. You can do that, but first tell me what happened while I was gone. Well, Ivy reported everything. The nephew's warning about rumors, Tom Fletcher's visit, the invitation to the gathering. Wade listened, his expression growing progressively darker. They're moving faster than I expected, he said finally. Building the narrative before we can counter it. That's smart on their part. So we counter it now. I go to Fletcher's gathering. I'm visible and normal. I give people first-hand evidence that I'm fine. And you keep working on this place, making it obvious you're competent. Wade gestured at the transformed kitchen, the organized pantry. Simon Wright can use all of this. Witness testimony, these documents, evidence of your ability to manage. It builds a case. But is it enough? Wade's silence was answer enough. They had evidence and witnesses and documented motive, but the Ross brothers had money and influence and the weight of social prejudice. In a territory where women were expected to be fragile and dependent, Ivy's strength and competence might actually work against her, could be twisted into evidence of unfeminine hardness, of something wrong and unnatural. We'll make it enough, Wade said finally. We keep gathering evidence, keep building the case, and when they make their move, we're ready. The gathering at Fletcher's ranch came on a Sunday, cold and clear. Tom Fletcher's son arrived mid-morning driving a wagon pulled by draft horses that handled the snow-packed roads with steady determination. Ivy had dressed carefully in her least shabby morning dress, had pinned her hair with precision, had practiced in the mirror until her expression showed pleasant neutrality rather than the anger that lived just beneath her skin. You look terrified, Wade observed as she prepared to leave. I am terrified. What if I say the wrong thing? What if someone asks about James and I can't hide what I really felt? Then you tell the truth. That he was difficult and you're still processing the loss. Anyone who expects you to play the grieving widow perfectly is unreasonable, and their opinion doesn't matter. Wade handed her a shawl. Just be yourself. That's what we need. Evidence that the real Ivy Marlowe is stable and capable. The Fletcher Ranch sat in a valley protected from the worst winds, a sprawling operation that spoke of generational success. When Ivy arrived, a dozen wagons already crowded the yard, and the house glowed with lamplight and warmth. Mrs. Fletcher met her at the door, a robust woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. Mrs. Marlowe, I'm so glad you could come. Tom said you were managing all alone out at the Callahan place. She took Ivy's cloak, ushered her into a crowded parlor where women gathered around quilting frames and men clustered near the fire. Let me introduce you around. The next hour passed in a blur of names and faces. Ivy met ranchers and their wives, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith's family, the couple who ran the dry goods store 2 towns over. Each introduction was a test, each conversation an opportunity to prove she was normal and sane and utterly unremarkable. Most people were kind. Some were curious about her situation with studied politeness that barely masked their interest in gossip. A few were openly sympathetic, having heard the stories about the Ross brothers' legal maneuvering and disapproving of tactics that targeted widows. But there were others. A rancher named Buckley, who'd clearly been drinking before he arrived, made pointed comments about women who didn't mourn properly. His wife, a pinched woman with mean eyes, asked loudly how Ivy was managing such an isolated situation with only a bachelor for company. The implication was clear and ugly, suggesting impropriety that could be added to instability in the Ross brothers' arsenal of accusations. Ivy kept her expression pleasant and her voice steady. Mr. Callahan has been nothing but respectful. I keep house and manage domestic affairs. He handles the livestock and outdoor work. It's a practical arrangement that benefits us both. Still, appearances matter, Mrs. Buckley sniffed. A young widow living alone with an unmarried man. People talk. Let them talk. Mrs. Fletcher's voice cut across the room with the authority of someone used to being heard. Mrs. Marlowe is managing a difficult situation with dignity and hard work. Anyone who suggests otherwise is more interested in gossip than truth. The rebuke was public and pointed. Mrs. Buckley's face reddened, but she subsided into silence. Around the room, Ivy saw nods of agreement, saw the social landscape shift in her favor. Mrs. Fletcher's endorsement carried weight, and she'd used it deliberately to shut down the ugliest speculation. Later, as the women gathered in the kitchen to prepare the midday meal, Ivy found herself working alongside the school teacher, a young woman named Sarah Martin who'd come west from Boston to teach in the territorial schools. "Don't let Mrs. Buckley bother you," Sarah said quietly as they sliced bread. "She's bitter about everything and everyone. Her opinions don't represent the community." "I appreciate that. I just hate feeling like I'm on trial every time I talk to someone." "You are on trial. That's the reality of being a woman in this territory, especially one in a complicated situation." Sarah's voice was matter of fact. "But you're handling it well. You seem perfectly stable and competent to me." "Would you be willing to say that in a legal proceeding?" Ivy asked before she could reconsider. Sarah paused, then nodded slowly. "If it came to that, yes. I don't know you well, but I know the Ross brothers' reputation. If they're claiming you're unfit, I'd guess it's for their own benefit, not yours." Another ally, another witness, another piece of evidence that Ivy wasn't the unstable widow the Ross brothers needed her to be. The meal was abundant: roasted meat, fresh bread, preserved vegetables, pies and cakes that spoke of community abundance. Ivy sat between Mrs. Fletcher and Sarah, listening more than talking, learning the social networks and alliances that govern this part of Montana territory. She watched who spoke to whom, who avoided certain topics, who held influence and who deferred to it. And she noticed when the door opened and Clay Ross walked in. He must have arrived while Ivy was in the kitchen, because suddenly he was there, accepting Mrs. Fletcher's hospitality with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere. His eyes found Ivy immediately, and his smile was all teeth and calculation. "Ivy, didn't expect to see you here. Mrs. Fletcher was kind enough to invite me." Ivy kept her voice level, aware that the entire room was watching this interaction. Of course she was. The Fletchers are good people, always helping those in need. The phrasing was careful, emphasizing Ivy as someone who needed help, someone dependent and possibly incapable. "How are you managing? We've been concerned, you being so isolated." "I'm managing quite well, actually. The ranch keeps me busy and I'm making friends in the community." "That's wonderful to hear, though Morgan mentioned he saw you in town recently and you seemed strained. We worry about the mental toll of everything you've been through." There it was, the public expression of concern that planted seeds of doubt. Ivy saw it working, saw people's expressions shift, saw them reassessing her with new suspicion. Was she strained? Was isolation affecting her? Could there be truth to the Ross brothers' concerns? Ivy forced herself to smile. "Your brother mistook normal grief for instability. I appreciate the concern, but I assure you I'm doing well. Mr. Callahan and I have established a good working arrangement, and I've been welcomed by the community. Still, if you ever need family support, I'll let you know." Ivy's voice hardened slightly. "But right now, I'm managing perfectly well without it." The tension in the room was palpable. Clay's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Of course, we just want what's best for you." "Then you'll respect that I'm capable of determining what's best for myself." Sarah's hand found Ivy's under the table, a brief squeeze of support. Around them, the other guests were watching with undisguised interest, seeing a confrontation that would fuel gossip for weeks. But Ivy had made her position clear. She wasn't a helpless woman needing the Ross brothers' intervention. She was someone standing her ground. Clay left soon after, making excuses about other obligations. When he was gone, the atmosphere lightened considerably, and conversations resumed their normal flow. But Ivy noticed the glances still directed her way, saw people reassessing, forming opinions that would spread through the territory faster than winter storms. Mrs. Fletcher found her as the gathering wound down. "You handled that well. Clay Ross is used to intimidating people into submission. Good to see someone stand up to him. I hope I didn't cause you problems by creating a scene." "Honey, you didn't create anything. He walked in here trying to undermine you in public, and you defended yourself with dignity. That's not causing problems. That's refusing to be a victim." Mrs. Fletcher patted her arm. "You come back any time. And if you need anything, anything at all, you send word. We take care of our own in this territory, and as far as I'm concerned, you're one of ours now." The ride back to Wade's ranch was quiet, Ivy processing everything that had happened while Fletcher's son drove with the focused attention of youth tasked with responsibility. When they arrived, Wade was waiting on the porch, his expression tense until he saw Ivy was safe. "How did it go?" he asked as soon as Fletcher's son had driven away. "Clay Ross showed up, tried to publicly express concern about my mental state." Ivy climbed the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. "I pushed back. Might have made things worse. Or you might have shown the community you're not someone who can be bullied into submission." Wade held the door open. "Tell me everything." Inside, over tea that Wade made while Ivy thawed by the stove, she recounted the gathering in detail. Every conversation, every veiled insult, every moment of support or suspicion. Wade listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively darker as she described Clay's calculated performance. "They're escalating," he said when she finished, "making it public, forcing you to defend yourself in front of witnesses. That's either desperation or confidence that they've already won. Which do you think it is?" Wade was quiet for a long moment. "I think they're trying to provoke you into doing something that looks unstable, making a scene, showing anger, anything that supports their narrative. And you didn't take the bait, which makes them nervous. So what now?" "Now we wait for their next move, because they'll make one. They have to. Spring's coming, and with it the judges' circuit. They need to file their petition for permanent guardianship before then, which means they need more evidence." Wade met her eyes. "They're going to come here, Ivy, soon. And whatever they do, whatever they accuse you of, we need to be ready." "I'm ready." Ivy's voice was hard. "I've spent 3 years being afraid of men who thought they owned me. I'm done being afraid." Wade nodded slowly. "Then we prepare. Document everything. Make sure we have witnesses to your stability, build the strongest case we can. And when they come, we stand together." "Together," Ivy echoed, and felt the words settle between them like a promise. That night, Ivy lay awake listening to the wind howl around the house, thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. James's death and her shameful relief, the Ross brothers' scheme, and her unwilling exile. Wade's unexpected alliance, and the community support she'd begun to build. Every piece of it felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter the careful case they were constructing. But she'd learned something important at the Fletcher gathering. She'd learned that she could face her accusers with dignity, could defend herself without apology, could stand her ground even when it would be easier to submit. That was worth more than all the legal documents and witness statements in the world. Because the Ross brothers could take her inheritance, could tie her up in legal battles for years. But they couldn't take the person she'd become in fighting back. They couldn't take the strength she'd discovered in refusing to be broken. And when they finally made their move, when they came with their accusations and their sheriff and their carefully constructed narrative, they'd find Ivy Marlowe wasn't the convenient victim they'd planned for. She was someone who'd survived worse than them and learned that survival sometimes required fighting back with everything you had. The wind screamed outside, rattling windows and piling snow against the walls. But inside, the fire burned steady and warm, and Ivy felt more ready for battle than she'd ever felt in her life. Let them come. She'd be waiting. 3 days after the gathering, a rider appeared just after dawn. Ivy saw him from the kitchen window. A man wearing a badge, riding slowly up the snow-packed road like he had all the time in the world. Behind him, 2 more riders. One was Morgan Ross. The other was Clay. The sheriff had arrived. And with him, the fight Ivy had been preparing for was about to begin. Wade was already moving before Ivy could speak, his hand going to the rifle by the door. But Ivy caught his arm, her grip firm. "No. We do this legal and proper. That's what they're expecting, for us to do something that makes us look dangerous or unstable." She released him, straightened her apron with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. "Let them come. We have nothing to hide." Wade's jaw was tight, but he nodded and set the rifle back in its place. Together they walked onto the porch, presenting a united front as the 3 riders approached. The morning was crystalline cold, the kind that made breath freeze in the air and turned the world into something brittle and sharp. The sheriff reached them first, A weathered man in his 50s with careful eyes that took in everything: the repaired fences, the organized yard, the smoke rising steady from the chimney. He touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, Wade, I'm Sheriff Porter. I apologize for the early hour, but we have some matters that need addressing." "What matters?" Wade's voice was level, giving nothing away. Morgan Ross urged his horse forward, his expression arranged in lines of concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff Porter has received some troubling reports about Mrs. Marlowe's condition. As her legal guardians, we felt obligated to investigate." "I'm standing right here," Ivy said quietly. "You can address your concerns to me directly." Porter dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Marlowe, I've been told you've been exhibiting signs of mental instability, isolation, erratic behavior, possible danger to yourself or others. The Ross family has petitioned for a formal evaluation of your competence." "Based on what evidence?" Wade demanded. Clay spoke from his horse, his voice carrying the edge of satisfaction. "Based on reports from multiple witnesses who've observed her strained mental state. Based on her isolation in a remote location with minimal supervision. Based on concerns about her judgment and capacity to manage her own affairs." "Those are accusations, not evidence," Ivy said, forcing herself to stay calm even as rage coiled in her chest. "I'd like to know specifically what I'm accused of doing that suggests instability." Porter pulled out a folded document, read from it with the flat tone of someone reciting legal language. "Failure to properly mourn your husband's death. Inappropriate emotional responses suggesting possible involvement in his death. Social isolation and withdrawal from community. Dependence on an unmarried man for basic care. Aggressive confrontations with family members attempting to provide support." Each accusation was carefully crafted, twisting truth just enough to make it ugly. Ivy's relief at James's death became evidence of murder. Her work on Wade's ranch became evidence of dependence. Her refusal to submit to the Ross brothers became evidence of aggression. "That's a creative interpretation of reality," Wade said, his voice hard. "Mrs. Marlowe has been working on this ranch, managing household affairs, and integrating into the community. I can provide witnesses who'll testify to her competence and stability." "And we can provide witnesses who'll testify otherwise," Morgan said smoothly. "The question isn't whether she's capable of performing basic tasks. It's whether she's mentally sound enough to manage legal affairs and property ownership. Given her recent trauma and current isolation, we believe a formal evaluation is warranted." Porter looked uncomfortable, caught between competing claims. "Mrs. Marlowe, I'm going to need you to come to town with us. There's a doctor who can perform a mental competency evaluation. It's standard procedure in cases like this." "Cases like what?" Ivy's voice sharpened. "Cases where a widow's family wants to steal her inheritance and will use any legal trick to do it?" "Careful," Morgan warned. "That kind of paranoid accusation is exactly what we're concerned about." The trap was perfect. If Ivy went calmly, she submitted to their narrative of instability. If she resisted, she proved it. Either way, the Ross brothers won. But Wade stepped forward, his presence solid and immovable. "She's not going anywhere without legal representation. Simon Wright should be present for any evaluation." "Mr. Wright can be summoned," Porter said. "But Mrs. Marlowe needs to come to town now. That's not optional." "And if I refuse?" Ivy asked. Porter's face was sympathetic but firm. "Then I'm authorized to take you into custody for your own protection. The petition claims you may be a danger to yourself." Ivy saw it clearly now, the full scope of their plan. Take her to town, isolate her from Wade's support, subject her to an evaluation conducted by a doctor who'd been paid or persuaded to find evidence of instability. By the time Simon Wright arrived, the damage would be done. The report would be filed, the competency judgment rendered, and the Ross brothers would have legal grounds to seize everything. "This is wrong, and you know it," Wade said to Porter. "This is powerful men using the law to rob a widow." "That's for the court to decide," Porter replied. "My job is to enforce the petition. Mrs. Marlowe, please get your coat." Ivy looked at Wade, saw the helpless fury in his face, the calculation happening behind his eyes as he weighed options that all ended badly. If he resisted, they'd both end up in custody. If he let her go, she faced the evaluation alone. She made the decision before he could. "I'll come," But I want it on record that I'm doing so under protest, and that I'm being coerced by men who have a financial interest in seeing me declared incompetent." "Noted," Porter said, though his tone suggested it wouldn't matter much. Ivy went inside to gather her coat and the carpet bag she'd kept packed since the gathering, the one holding copies of all their documents, the will, the witness statements, the property survey. Wade followed her, his voice low and urgent. "I'll ride to town. Get Simon right. We'll fight this." "They're counting on that. They'll delay, drag things out, make sure the evaluation happens before Wright can intervene." Ivy tied her bonnet with trembling fingers. "But we have one advantage they don't know about." "What's that?" "I'm not actually unstable. Any honest evaluation will show that." She met his eyes. "Trust me to handle this part. You go get Wright, bring those documents we've been collecting, but let me face them first." Wade looked like he wanted to argue, to fight, to do something other than watch her ride away with the sheriff and the men trying to destroy her. But he nodded tightly. "I'll be there as fast as I can. And Ivy, don't let them break you." "They've been trying to break me for months, haven't managed it yet." Outside, Morgan had dismounted and stood waiting with the kind of patience that came from confidence in victory. Clay remained on his horse, grinning like he'd already won. The sheriff helped Ivy into his wagon, his grip on her arm firmer than necessary, making a show of treating her like someone who needed physical restraint. As they pulled away, Ivy looked back once to see Wade standing on the porch, rigid, with controlled fury, his hand on the post like he was holding himself back from doing something rash. Then the ranch disappeared behind a rise, and she was alone with her enemies, heading toward a confrontation she'd been preparing for since the night James died. The ride to Elkton took 3 hours through snow that had started falling again, thick flakes that reduced visibility and made the horses work hard. Morgan rode alongside the wagon, making conversation that was designed to seem concerned but served to build his case. "You understand we're doing this for your own good, Ivy. After everything you've been through, it's natural to need support." Ivy didn't respond, just stared straight ahead. "The isolation can't have been healthy. Being alone with Wade Callahan, a man you barely know. We've heard things, you know, about impropriety, about arrangements that seem questionable." Still Ivy said nothing, refusing to give them ammunition. Clay laughed from his horse. "She's not talking, Morgan. Probably been coached by Wade on what to say. Or maybe she really is losing her grip on reality." "I'm sitting right here," Ivy said finally, her voice cold, "and I can hear you constructing false narratives. But it won't work. I'm completely sane, and any honest evaluation will prove it." "We'll see," Morgan said. "Sometimes people don't realize how far they've slipped until professional assessment reveals the truth." The threat was clear. The evaluation wouldn't be honest. They'd made arrangements, paid the right people, ensured the outcome they needed. Ivy felt fear try to claw its way up her throat, but pushed it down. Fear was what they wanted. Fear made people compliant. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Elkton was busy when they arrived, the main street crowded with people conducting business between storms. Ivy saw faces turn as the sheriff's wagon passed, saw the speculation in their eyes. The Marlowe widow, being brought to town by the law. The gossip would spread like wildfire, and by evening, everyone would know she'd been taken for a mental evaluation. Porter drove directly to a building near the church, a neat structure with a sign reading, "Dr. Hastings, Medical Services." Morgan helped Ivy down with false solicitude, his hand on her arm possessive and controlling. "Dr. Hastings is expecting us. He's very experienced in these matters." Inside, the doctor's office was warm and smelled of carbolic acid and old paper. Dr. Hastings himself was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of neutral expression that gave nothing away. He greeted the Ross brothers like old friends, and Porter with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Marlowe, please have a seat. We'll get started with the evaluation right away." "I'd prefer to wait for my lawyer," Ivy said. "That won't be necessary. This is a medical evaluation, not a legal proceeding." Hastings sat behind his desk, pulled out forms. "I just need to ask you some questions, perform a few standard assessments. Nothing invasive or concerning." "And who's paying for this evaluation?" Ivy asked. Hastings blinked. "That's not relevant to the medical assessment." "It's completely relevant. The Ross brothers have a financial interest in seeing me declared incompetent. If they're paying you, this evaluation is compromised from the start. Morgan's voice hardened. That's exactly the kind of paranoid thinking we're concerned about. Seeing conspiracy where there's only family concern. Is it paranoia when the conspiracy is real? Ivy looked at each of them in turn. You want my land. The inheritance that should be mine. The only way you can take it is if I'm declared unfit. So you manufacture evidence, spread rumors, and now you're conducting a biased evaluation designed to confirm your lies. Sheriff, you're seeing this, yes? Clay gestured at Ivy. The aggressive accusations, the refusal to cooperate with medical care. This is exactly what we've been talking about. Porter looked deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Marlowe, you're not helping your case. My case is that I'm a sane woman being railroaded by powerful men. How exactly am I supposed to prove sanity when anything I say can be twisted into evidence of instability? Ivy turned to Hastings. Ask your questions, doctor, but I want it on record that this evaluation is being conducted under duress and with clear bias. Hastings adjusted his spectacles. Very well. Let's begin with some basic questions. Can you tell me today's date? The evaluation continued for 2 hours. Hastings asked about her emotional state, her daily routines, her relationships, her plans for the future. Some questions seemed legitimate medical inquiry. Others were clearly designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as unstable. Questions about her marriage that assumed she should be devastated rather than relieved. Questions about her living situation that framed dependence on Wade as evidence of incompetence. Ivy answered carefully, honestly, refusing to perform the grief they wanted to see. Yes, her marriage had been difficult. No, she didn't miss James. Yes, she felt relief at his death because it meant freedom from abuse. No, that didn't mean she'd killed him. Yes, she was living with Wade Callahan. No, their arrangement wasn't improper. Yes, she was managing household affairs competently. No, she didn't feel isolated or unstable. Throughout the evaluation, Morgan and Clay sat watching, occasionally interjecting comments designed to undermine her responses. Hastings took copious notes, his expression never shifting from professional neutrality. When it finally ended, Hastings set down his pen. I'll need time to review my findings and prepare a formal report. That should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. And in the meantime? Morgan asked. In the meantime, Mrs. Marlowe should remain in town where she can be monitored. I recommend she stay at the boarding house under Sheriff Porter's supervision. I'd rather return to the ranch, Ivy said. That's not advisable. Hastings stood, clearly dismissing her. Given the concerns raised, it's better you remain where proper supervision is available. So they'd trap her in town, isolated from Wade and any support he might provide, while they finalized their scheme. Ivy saw the full picture now. The evaluation was just theater. The real decision had already been made. But before Porter could escort her to the boarding house, the door burst open and Simon Wright strode in, his face flushed from cold and exertion. Behind him came Wade, snow-covered from hard riding, his eyes blazing. This evaluation is terminated immediately, Wright announced. Any findings are inadmissible due to lack of proper legal representation and clear bias in the examining physician. Hastings drew himself up. I'm conducting a legitimate medical evaluation as requested by the legal guardians. The guardianship itself is under legal challenge and should not have been used to authorize this evaluation. Wright pulled papers from his satchel, spread them on the desk. I'm filing an emergency motion to void the guardianship agreement based on fraud and coercion, and I'm formally objecting to any findings from this compromised evaluation. Morgan's face darkened. You can't stop this, Wright. We have legal standing and legitimate concerns. Your legal standing is based on an agreement Wade Callahan signed under false pretenses. He was told it was a land access deal, not a guardianship transfer. Wright's voice was sharp, precise. That's fraud, gentlemen, and I have documentation proving it. He pulled out the original agreement, the one Ivy had found in Wade's pocket that first night. Wright had annotated it, highlighting the deceptive language, the sections that had been deliberately obscured. Beside it, he laid Wade's sworn statement describing what he'd been told versus what he'd actually signed. This agreement is void, Wright declared, which means you have no legal authority over Mrs. Marlowe, which means this evaluation was conducted without proper authorization, which means every piece of paper Dr. Hastings just filled out is worthless. The silence that followed was electric. Ivy saw Morgan and Clay exchange glances, saw the calculation happening as they reassessed their position. Hastings looked between the lawyers and the Ross brothers like a man realizing he'd been used for something that might destroy his reputation. Porter spoke carefully. If the guardianship is void, then Mrs. Marlowe is free to go. The guardianship stands until a judge rules otherwise, Morgan insisted. Actually, it doesn't. Wright's smile was thin and sharp. In territorial law, an agreement obtained through fraud is void from inception, not from the date of judgment. The moment I file this motion, which I'm doing right now, the guardianship ceases to have legal effect pending judicial review. He handed papers to Porter, who read them with growing interest. Ivy saw the sheriff's expression shift from uncomfortable obligation to something like relief. He'd been forced to enforce a law he didn't believe in. Now he had legal grounds to step back. Well then, Porter said slowly, seems like Mrs. Marlowe is free to return to her residence. No legal authority says otherwise. This isn't over, Morgan said, his voice low and dangerous. We'll fight this in court. We'll prove she's unfit and that the inheritance is rightfully ours. Please do, Wright said pleasantly. I look forward to presenting evidence of your fraud, your intimidation tactics, and your attempted theft of a widow's property. I'm sure Judge Morrison will be fascinated. Clay stood abruptly. You're making a mistake, Wright. The Ross family doesn't forget enemies. Neither do I, and I have a very long memory for men who try to rob widows using legal trickery. Wright gathered his papers. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to discuss the actual legal situation with my client, privately. The Ross brothers left with Porter, Morgan pausing at the door to deliver one final threat. This isn't finished, Ivy. We'll see you in court. I'll be there, Ivy replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline making her hands shake. And I'll win. When they were finally alone, Ivy felt her legs go weak. Wade caught her before she could sink, his arms solid around her waist. I've got you. That was too close, she whispered, but we won this round. Wright was already organizing documents, his mind clearly racing ahead to the next battle. The guardianship is effectively void. They have no legal control over you anymore. But they'll come at you differently now. Direct challenge to the inheritance, probably arguing that as James's blood relatives, they have stronger claim than you do as his widow. She says, can they win that argument? Not if we prove the land was specifically willed to James, not to the family trust. And not if we can demonstrate their motive for wanting you discredited. Wright looked at Wade. That property survey you found, that's crucial. It proves why they want the land badly enough to commit fraud. Wade nodded. I've got more too. Financial records showing they've been buying up surrounding properties, consolidating water rights. That land Ivy inherited is the missing piece of their plan. Without it, their entire expansion strategy falls apart. Perfect. We use that to show motive, combine it with witness testimony about their intimidation tactics, add evidence of their fraudulent guardianship, and we build a case that's about more than just inheritance. It's about a pattern of illegal behavior. Wright was fully engaged now, the legal strategist finding his ground. We file everything together, make it impossible for them to separate the inheritance question from their conduct question. Either they're honest people with legitimate concerns, or they're criminals trying to steal property. Can't be both. Ivy listened to them plan, felt hope building despite exhaustion. What happens now? Today, I mean. Now you go back to the ranch. Live your life, document your competence, stay visible in the community. Wright met her eyes. And we prepare for the hearing. When Judge Morrison makes his circuit through here in 6 weeks, we'll present everything, every document, every witness, every piece of evidence, and we'll end this. 6 weeks. 6 more weeks of uncertainty, of looking over her shoulder, of wondering if the Ross brothers would make another move. But 6 weeks was better than 6 months or 6 years of legal battles. It was an endpoint, a finish line she could see and aim for. Wade drove her back to the ranch as afternoon faded into evening, the wagon loaded with supplies he'd purchased while waiting for Wright to arrive. They rode in silence for a long time, both processing what had happened, what it meant, what came next. Finally, Wade spoke. You were brave in there, standing up to them, refusing to be intimidated. I was terrified. Brave and terrified aren't opposites. Brave is being terrified and doing it anyway. He glanced at her. Your husband ever tell you that you were strong? James told me I was stubborn, difficult, unwomanly, pretty much the opposite of strong. Then James was a fool. Wade's voice was quiet but certain. You're the strongest person I've met. And I've known soldiers who faced down enemy fire with less courage than you showed today. Ivy felt tears threaten, the emotional release of a day spent holding everything together by force of will. I couldn't have done it without you, without Wright. I'd have been alone in that room with them and they'd have won. But you weren't alone, and they didn't win. Wade's hand found hers, squeezed once, then released. And 6 weeks from now, when the judge rules in your favor, they'll have lost completely. The ranch appeared in the distance, lamplight glowing in the windows that Ivy must have left burning. It looked like home. Not the prison the Ross brothers had intended, but an actual home where she'd built something real from nothing, where she'd found allies and purpose and the strength to fight back. When they reached the house, Wade insisted on handling the horses while Ivy went inside to warm up. She made coffee, started dinner from the supplies Wade had brought, and tried to process the fact that she'd won. Not the war, not yet, but this battle, this crucial, terrifying battle that could have ended with her locked away as incompetent, unable to fight for anything. Wade came in stamping snow from his boots, his face red from cold. He poured coffee, sat at the table with the weariness of someone who'd ridden hard through winter weather on pure determination. Wright's good, he said. Better than I expected. He actually cares about this. He said he became a lawyer because justice matters more than power. I think he meant it. Rare thing in this territory, lawyers who care more about right than profit. Wade sipped his coffee. Makes me think we might actually win this. We have to win. I can't go through this again. Ivy's voice cracked slightly. Can't spend my life fighting the Ross brothers for what's rightfully mine. You won't have to. 6 weeks. We gather every piece of evidence, we line up every witness, we make it impossible for the judge to rule any way except in your favor. They spent the evening planning, making lists, identifying what still needed to be collected or documented. Wade would ride to the county land office, get official copies of all property records. Ivy would write to Mrs. Chen, to the bartender, to anyone else who could testify about James's drinking and violence. Wright would draft the legal arguments, the motions, the formal challenges to the Ross brothers' claims. It was past midnight when they finally stopped, both of them exhausted, but feeling like they had a path forward. Wade banked the fire while Ivy cleaned up from dinner, the domestic routines comforting in their normalcy. Ivy, Wade said as she headed toward the bedroom. Thank you. For what? For trusting me to help, for not giving up when it would have been easier, for being the kind of person worth fighting for. His expression was serious, open in a way she'd never seen. I came to this territory to hide from life. You reminded me that some things are worth coming back for. Ivy felt something shift between them, something that had been building since that first night when she'd arrived as unwanted cargo and Wade had chosen to see her as a person instead of a problem. They'd become partners, allies, friends. But standing here in lamplight with his words hanging between them, Ivy recognized what had been growing beneath the practical alliance. Trust. Respect. Something that felt dangerously like affection. Wade, she started, but he shook his head. We'll talk about it after the hearing. After this is settled and you're free to make choices without legal battles hanging over your head. He moved toward his bed near the stove. For now, we focus on winning. He was right, Ivy knew. Anything else was complication they didn't need. But lying in the bedroom later, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, she let herself imagine a future beyond the hearing. A future where the ranch was truly home, where the partnership they'd built could become something more, where the life she'd been forced into could transform into the life she chose. 6 weeks. Just 6 more weeks of gathering evidence and building the case and staying strong. She could do that. She'd already survived so much worse. The weeks that followed blurred into focused preparation. Wade made trip after trip to various county offices, returning with property deeds, transfer records, financial documents that painted a clear picture of the Ross brothers' land consolidation strategy. Ivy wrote letters and received responses, building a file of testimony about James's drinking, his violence, the night he died. Wright worked with them to organize everything into a comprehensive case that was part inheritance dispute, part fraud prosecution. And through it all, Ivy made sure to stay visible. She attended church services, shopped at the general store, accepted invitations to quilting bees and community gatherings. Every interaction was another witness to her stability, another person who could testify she was managing perfectly well. Thank you very much. The Ross brothers tried one more gambit 2 weeks before the hearing. Clay showed up at the ranch claiming they'd found new evidence that Ivy had been seen purchasing rat poison shortly before James died. The implication was clear: murder, not accident. But Ivy had been expecting something like this. She calmly pulled out the receipt for the poison, dated 3 months before James's death, and the testimony from Wade's barn manager who'd used it to deal with a rodent infestation in the grain stores. Clay left empty-handed. His latest attempt to manufacture evidence turned into further proof of the Ross brothers' dishonest tactics. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, the Elkton courthouse was packed. The entire community seemed to have turned out, some supporting the Ross family's established position, others curious about the widow who dared to fight back against powerful men, still others genuinely interested in seeing justice done. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen every legal trick and was impressed by none of them. He called the proceedings to order with a crack of his gavel that silenced the room immediately. We're here to settle multiple disputes: the validity of a guardianship agreement, the rightful inheritance of property following James Marlowe's death, and allegations of fraud and intimidation. Mr. Wright, you filed the initial motion. Present your case. What followed was 3 hours of testimony, document presentation, and legal argument. Wright was methodical and devastating, building his case piece by piece. He presented Wade's testimony about the fraudulent guardianship. He showed the property survey proving the Ross brothers' motive. He called witness after witness: Mrs. Hoskins, Tom Fletcher, Sarah the schoolteacher, even Dr. Hastings, who admitted under questioning that the Ross brothers had paid for the evaluation and suggested what findings would be helpful. The Ross brothers' lawyer tried to counter with character assassination, suggesting Ivy's relief at James's death proved guilt, that her living arrangement with Wade was improper, that a woman couldn't possibly manage property alone. But Wright demolished each argument with facts, with witness testimony, with documentation that showed Ivy was not only capable, but had been actively managing ranch affairs while her accusers spread lies. Then Wright called Ivy to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, wearing the one good dress she owned, her hands steady, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. Wright guided her through her testimony with gentle precision: her marriage to James, his drinking, his violence, the night he died, her relief, and the Ross brothers' immediate suspicion, the guardianship trap, and the attempted evaluation. Mrs. Marlowe, Wright said finally, in your own words, tell the court what this fight is really about. Ivy looked at Judge Morrison, then at the Ross brothers sitting with their lawyer, then at the packed courtroom full of people who would judge her regardless of the legal outcome. This fight is about powerful men believing they have the right to take what isn't theirs simply because they can, she said clearly. It's about using the law as a weapon against someone they see as weak and alone. It's about assuming a widow has no rights, no voice, no recourse against family members who want to rob her. But mostly, it's about me refusing to accept that narrative. I'm not weak. I'm not alone. And I will not surrender what's rightfully mine to men who think intimidation and fraud are acceptable business practices. The courtroom was utterly silent. Ivy saw faces in the crowd, some sympathetic, some impressed, some still skeptical. But they were all listening, all hearing her side of the story told in her own voice without apology or performance. The Ross brothers' lawyer tried to discredit her on cross-examination, but Ivy had been through too much to be rattled now. She answered every question honestly, refused to be provoked into anger, maintained the composure of someone who knew the truth was on her side. When testimony finally concluded, Judge Morrison called a recess to review the evidence. Ivy sat with Wade and Wright in the courthouse hallway, too nervous to eat the lunch Wade had brought, too exhausted to do anything but wait. After 2 hours, the bailiff called them back. The courtroom filled again, the crowd larger now as word spread that a verdict was coming. Ivy took her seat at the plaintiff's table, Wade beside her, right on her other side. Across the aisle, Morgan and Clay Ross sat with rigid fury poorly masked by professional neutrality. Judge Morrison entered and everyone stood. When he settled behind his bench, his expression was grave. This court has reviewed all evidence and testimony presented. I'm prepared to rule on all matters before me. He adjusted his spectacles, looked directly at the Ross brothers. First, regarding the guardianship agreement, it is clear from testimony and documentation that Mr. Callahan was deliberately misled about the nature of the document he signed. The guardianship provision was buried in language designed to obscure its true purpose. This constitutes fraud. The guardianship agreement is therefore void from inception and has no legal effect. Ivy felt Wade's hand find hers under the table, squeezing hard. Second, regarding the inheritance of the Marlowe property. The will is clear and unambiguous. The land was bequeathed to James Marlowe specifically, with provision that it pass to his widow upon his death without issue. Mrs. Marlowe is the rightful heir. The Ross family has no legal claim to this property. Morgan's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we'd like to present additional evidence regarding Mrs. Marlowe's potential involvement in her husband's death. Sit down, counselor. Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. I've reviewed the doctor's report on James Marlowe's death. The injuries are entirely consistent with an accidental fall. There is zero evidence of foul play. What there is, however, is substantial evidence that the Ross family manufactured suspicion to discredit Mrs. Marlowe in pursuit of property they wanted. That behavior borders on criminal conspiracy. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Morrison's gavel silenced them. Third, regarding allegations of fraud and intimidation. The evidence presented shows a pattern of behavior designed to illegally obtain property through manipulation of legal systems and exploitation of a vulnerable widow. I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for investigation of potential criminal charges against Morgan and Clay Ross. Clay shot to his feet. This is outrageous. We were protecting family interests. You were committing fraud. Sit down before I hold you in contempt. Morrison waited until Clay reluctantly sat, then turned to Ivy. Mrs. Marlowe, this court finds in your favor on all matters. The property is yours free and clear. The fraudulent guardianship is void. And I want to say personally that you showed remarkable courage in fighting this case. Many would have surrendered rather than face down powerful opponents. Your refusal to do so has exposed serious misconduct that might otherwise have continued unchecked. Ivy couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She'd won. Actually won. The inheritance was hers, the guardianship was gone, and the Ross brothers were facing criminal investigation for their schemes. Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm ordering the Ross family to pay all legal costs incurred by Mrs. Marlowe in defending herself against these fraudulent claims. And I'm issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting any member of the Ross family from contacting Mrs. Marlowe or entering her property without legal authorization. His gavel came down with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded into noise, conversation, argument, the scrape of chairs as people stood. Ivy sat frozen, overwhelmed, until Wright's hand on her shoulder brought her back. We won, he said simply. It's over. It's over, Ivy repeated, testing the words. Then louder, with growing certainty. It's over. Wade pulled her into a fierce hug, his relief palpable. Around them, people were approaching. Mrs. Hoskins to offer congratulations, Tom Fletcher to shake Wade's hand, Sarah the schoolteacher to say she'd known all along Ivy would prevail. Even Sheriff Porter stopped by to apologize for the role he'd been forced to play. But the Ross brothers left without a word, their lawyer hurrying them out a side door before the crowd could turn ugly. Ivy watched them go and felt nothing. Not triumph, not vindication, just profound relief that their power over her life had finally ended. Outside the courthouse, Wright gave final instructions. The property deed needs to be formally transferred. I'll handle that paperwork. You'll need to visit the land office to register yourself as sole owner. And there's the matter of what happens with the Ross brothers' criminal investigation, but that's not your concern anymore unless the prosecutor needs your testimony. What will happen to them? Ivy asked. Hard to say. Fraud charges in property matters are serious, but they have money for good lawyers. They might avoid prison, but they'll certainly face fines, loss of reputation, possibly disbarment if they've used similar tactics before. Wright smiled. At minimum, they'll think twice before trying to rob another widow. They parted with promises to stay in touch, with Wright refusing additional payment beyond what the court had ordered the Ross brothers to cover. "This one was for justice," he said. "Doesn't happen often enough in my practice. Felt good to win one that mattered." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both Ivy and Wade processing everything that had happened. The February afternoon was cold but clear, the kind of day where the mountains stood sharp against impossible blue sky. Spring was still weeks away, but Ivy could feel it coming, the subtle shift in light, the way snow was starting to melt on south-facing slopes, the promise of renewal after a brutal winter. When they reached the ranch, Wade helped her down from the wagon with unusual formality. "This is your property now, legally, officially yours. I should probably clarify what our arrangement is going forward." Ivy hadn't thought that far ahead. "What do you want it to be?" "Depends on what you want." Wade looked uncomfortable, a man unused to discussing feelings. "I signed that agreement thinking it was just business. It became something else. You became someone I—" He stopped, started again. "You could sell the property, take the money, start fresh somewhere else. Or you could stay here, run it yourself, hire someone else to help with the work." "Or," Ivy prompted, "or we could make this partnership official, legal, real." Wade met her eyes. "Marry me, Ivy, not because anyone's forcing us together, but because we work well as a team. Because I trust you and I think you trust me. Because this ranch could be something better with both of us building it than either of us could manage alone." It wasn't a romantic proposal. There were no flowers, no pretty words, no declarations of passionate love, but it was honest and practical and completely suited to who they'd become together. "You sure?" Ivy asked. "You've been alone 5 years by choice. You said you couldn't protect someone again." "I said that when I was hiding from life. You taught me the difference between protecting someone and partnering with them. I failed my first wife by trying to do everything alone, by not trusting her to stand with me when danger came. I won't make that mistake again." Ivy thought about the months since she'd arrived, the slow building of trust, the partnership forged in shared struggle, the way they'd learned to depend on each other. She thought about Wade's steadfast support, his willingness to fight for her when he could have simply walked away. She thought about this person she'd become here, stronger and more certain than she'd ever been. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." Wade's smile was small but genuine, relief and happiness mixing in equal measure. He pulled her close, kissed her with the careful intensity of someone who'd thought he'd never feel this again. Ivy kissed him back, tasting coffee and winter cold and the promise of a future they'd build together. When they finally broke apart, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "Fair warning, I'm terrible at being romantic. I work too hard, I talk too little, and I'll probably drive you crazy with my silences. And I'm stubborn, independent to a fault, and I won't tolerate being treated like property ever again." Ivy smiled. "Sounds like we're well matched." They married 3 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at the church, with Simon Wright as witness and half the community in attendance. Ivy wore a dress Mrs. Hoskins helped her make from fabric Wade had bought without being asked, pale blue instead of morning black. Wade wore his one good suit and looked uncomfortable in it, but his eyes when he saw Ivy walking toward him held something like wonder. The preacher kept it brief, probably sensing that neither bride nor groom wanted elaborate ceremony. When he pronounced them married, Wade kissed Ivy with more confidence than their first kiss, and the congregation erupted in applause. At the gathering afterward, people brought food and gifts, offering congratulations that felt genuine. Mrs. Hoskins cried and said she'd known from the start they were meant for each other. Tom Fletcher gave Wade advice about managing a partnership that made Wade actually laugh. Sarah, the schoolteacher, whispered to Ivy that she'd inspired half the unmarried women in the territory to hold out for partners who respected them as equals. Even the prosecutor stopped by to inform Ivy that the Ross brothers had accepted a plea agreement, substantial fines, return of other properties obtained through similar fraud, and a ban from holding any position of trust in the territory. Not prison, but enough to break their power and reputation. As the sun set and the gathering wound down, Wade and Ivy stood on the porch of what was now legally their shared home, watching the last guest depart. The March evening was cold, but carried the scent of snowmelt and possibility. "We should probably go inside before we freeze," Wade said. "Probably." But Ivy didn't move, content to stand here with Wade's arm around her shoulders, looking at the ranch they'd defended and would now build together. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked. "That the Ross brothers meant to punish me by sending me here. Thought isolation would break me, that dependence on a stranger would make me easier to control." Ivy leaned into Wade's warmth. "They had no idea what they actually did." "What's that?" "Gave me exactly what I needed. A place to stand, an ally to stand with, and the space to become someone stronger than I'd ever been." She turned to face him. "So in a way, I should thank them." Wade laughed, the sound rare and precious. "Let's not go that far." "Fine. But I'm grateful anyway. For you, for this place, for everything that came from their attempt to destroy me." Ivy smiled. "Turns out the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something better than what they tried to take away." Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, transformed from the hermit shelter it had been into an actual home. The kitchen Ivy had organized, the curtains she'd mended, the small touches that said two people lived here now in partnership rather than isolation. Wade built up the fire while Ivy made tea, the domestic routines comfortable and familiar. When they finally settled together near the stove, Wade's arm around her and her head on his shoulder, Ivy felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Safety. Home. Not the desperate temporary safety of surviving another day with James. Not the fearful hiding of being trapped by the Ross brothers' schemes, but the deep, lasting security of being exactly where she belonged, with someone who valued her strength rather than fearing it. Outside, winter was releasing its grip on Montana territory. Soon the snow would melt fully, the grass would green, the horses would foal, and the ranch would come alive with the work of spring. There would be challenges ahead, difficulties to overcome, the normal struggles of building a life from raw land and stubborn determination. But Ivy had learned something important in the months since she'd arrived as unwanted cargo on a wagon she never asked to ride. She'd learned that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about refusing to stay broken. It was about finding allies and building partnerships. It was about standing your ground even when everyone said surrender was easier. She'd survived an abusive marriage, a family's betrayal, a legal system designed to favor powerful men over vulnerable women. She'd fought back and won, not through violence or deception, but through courage and honesty and the stubborn refusal to accept what others decided was her fate. And now, sitting in a warm house beside a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than property to be controlled, Ivy finally understood what the Ross brothers had never grasped. You couldn't break someone who'd already been broken and learned to forge themselves stronger in the healing. You couldn't steal from someone who'd discovered that the things that mattered most, dignity, purpose, authentic partnership, couldn't be taken by legal tricks or intimidation. The Ross brothers had meant to dispose of an inconvenient widow. Instead, they'd created their own nemesis, someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required fighting back with everything you had. And Ivy had fought back, had stood her ground, had won. Not just the legal battle or the property or the inheritance, she'd won herself back. The person she'd buried during 3 years with James, the strength she'd forgotten she possessed, the future she'd stopped believing was possible. Wade's hand found hers in the firelight, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of partners who'd faced danger together and chosen to keep standing side by side. "To new beginnings," he said quietly. "To building something better," Ivy replied. Outside, the Montana night settled over their ranch, cold and clear and full of stars. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm. And two people who'd been pushed together by other people's cruelty discovered that sometimes the worst circumstances could forge the strongest partnerships. The Ross brothers had wanted to bury Ivy Marlowe in isolation and fear. Instead, they'd given her the space and motivation to become someone who couldn't be buried at all. And that, Ivy thought as she drifted toward sleep in Wade's arms, was the sweetest victory of all.